In the province of Sichuan in the demonic forest, the father talked to his son in the Tezen ward and asked if he remembered his childhood in Iran. Mughan replied that the sister was smart and persistent. The father stood opposite and added that she literally grabbed everything on the fly. The old man raised his eyes to the sky and told the godfather that it was all thanks to the heavenly Een. It was the previous head of the demonic forest and the current head of Taesang Cho Pension. Heavenly Een was a feature of the body in which the energy promotes rapid progress, but using it the vessels are strongly influenced by the Een energy. Some warriors call it a blessing, but the old man believed that for their family it was just a curse that took away a loved one. Mughan did not interrupt his father and listened to him, carefully looking in his direction. He thought his every word in advance. The man asked if the father regretted breaking ties with Iran. The old man replied that this was his only regret in life. The head didn't want his daughter to spend her life arrest outside of the demonic forest, but then he couldn't take her out of there. The father learned that his daughter struggling with a serious illness gave birth to a child. It was very difficult for him to accept this as a father. After listening to his father, Mughan appreciated his position and decided to take advantage of the situation to say something. Punchin was interested. The current head of the demonic forest folded his hands in front of him and said that he was going to make Irina's son the successor to the throne. He added that a letter had recently arrived from Shaanxi province and the young man would be here very soon. The decision was made for the benefit of the forest. After finishing his speech, Mughan asked his father to show leniency and give permission to manage Qin Murup's country. Cho Pyongkan slowly turned his head towards his son and didn't say a word. He considered all options for the development of events in advance. He smiled when he remembered Irina's son. He was the old man's grandson, and he couldn't believe that he had grown up so fast. Meanwhile, the young man was in Shaanxi province. High rocks were located near the Yellow River, which were the creation of a mountain river. Suddenly, the rocks began to shake as if from an earthquake. All the birds left the place to save their lives. The rocks continued to move more and more, about to fall. Pieces of stones have already started flying in different directions. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion in this area, which was accompanied by a burst of energy. A battle was fought in this area. The long-haired youth blocked the enemy's blow, who decided to break one of the rocks to deliver a powerful blow to the enemy. This man was a young man with demonic red eyes. After carrying out his last attack, he smiled sinisterly in the face of the enemy. Then he decided to launch another attack called the Millennium Dragon Claw. His opponent did not expect such speed. The red-eyed man swung a powerful punch in front of him, emitting a colossal amount of purple energy. However, the long-haired brunette turned out to be quite a skilled opponent. He dodged the enemy's attack with one downward movement of his body. The young man looked at the dangerous hand of the enemy and thought about the fact that he avoided the attack at the very last moment. He must have been lucky. After avoiding the enemy's attack, the long-haired boy fell back and asked the enemy who he was. The attacker replied that he was the yellow dragon as he continued to attack. The young man called him a real fool, not a dragon. The attacker was indeed one of the 5 dragons, the Yellow King. He swung and told the opponent that he would have to kill him if he didn't want to use his inner energy. The young man was the same Qin Murup who was the head of Sanshin. He told the enemy that if he used the energy, the enemy would surely die. Qin Murup added that he would just get a cap. A sinister smile appeared on the dragon's face. He asked what this expression was. King Huanghe called his opponent's teacher a moron if he taught him that. Murup looked at the enemy in response. He said that such simple provocations will not work on him. The dragon did not expect such an answer, but how much he was going to continue the fight. But then Murup agreed to engage in a real battle with the enemy. These words literally lifted the dragon's mood. The young man opposite took a rope and tied his long hair in a bun. He told the enemy to prepare and watch carefully. After that, Murup got into a fighting stance and was going to show the enemy everything he was able to learn from his clueless teacher. The young man brought his 2 hands as close as possible to each other and began to make strange sounds with the help of his mouth. He seemed to be scrolling some kind of instrument in his hands, making creaking sounds. It looked quite realistic. Murup continued to stand still, and his movements finally began to bring some result. His fingers moved. King Huanghe carefully watched the actions of his opponent and could not understand what was happening at this moment. After finishing his technique, Qin Murup showed his middle finger to the enemy and called it a god-level provocation while laughing loudly. The dragon was simply beside himself after these actions. He became very angry with the enemy and he continued to mock at the same time. The man shouted that he was not affected at all, although from the side the situation looked completely different. Murup continued to taunt the enemy, poking at him with his finger. The dragon promised himself to finish off the enemy at any cost. The young man finished laughing at the enemy and abruptly moved from his place, saying that the enemy began to open up to blows. In a fraction of a second, Murup found himself in front of the enemy's face and struck him with a powerful blow that made the man fly back. The dragon was simply shocked by this turn of events. All he could do was scream helplessly in flight. Qin Murup successfully used his advantage on the battlefield, lulling the enemy's vigilance, and dealt him a powerful, unexpected blow. The blow was so powerful that the dragon flew through dozens of rocks before stopping. He continued to marvel at Qin's skill. One of the 5 dragons lay helplessly on the side of the rock and thought about the fact that some fool was able to defeat him, one of the 10 best masters. Qin Murup approached his enemy and told him to get up. The dragon opened his eyes and looked in front of him in fear. The young man delivered a powerful blow to the face of his enemy, who was already lying on the ground. The dragon was just shocked again. Murup shouted loudly at his opponent, ordering him to immediately rise to his feet and calling him a rag. The dragon said that he was conscious and there was no need to beat him. Murup replied that he had been unconscious for 30 minutes, so he had to do this. The Yellow King told his opponent to kill him. Murup replied that there was no need for this and advised to engage in energy circulation. The dragon called his opponent a fool. Murup shook off the dust from his clothes and was about to say something before his departure. He looked at his opponent with a serious look and said that next time he would really kill him if he just fought like that. The dragon listened to his interlocutor and smiled sinisterly in return. Murup asked the man what his answer would be. Not getting an answer, the young man decided to teach the enemy more. The dragon began to stop the young man and say that he nodded in response. Murup still did not stop and gave a powerful slap to the dragon. He did it because he insulted his teacher. King Huanghe was pleasantly surprised by this turn of events. He was satisfied that it was just a slap in the face. He put himself in the place of the enemy and thought that he would definitely break both his arms, but Murup turned out to be more generous. The dragon said that he thought he had no enemies in this world besides the other 9 masters, but meeting the young man made him think twice. He offered the enemy to give him the title of one of the 5 dragons. Murup replied that somehow he would live without this title. King Huanghe advised the young man not to refuse such an offer and added that he would prepare a place for him among the 5 dragons. Looking at the mighty figure of his opponent, the dragon asked when he would be able to meet him again to challenge him again. Murup slowly turned his head to the side of the enemy and answered that he was not leaving Sanshan forever, but only for a while. He smiled and added that the enemy would never be able to find him because he was very good at playing hide and seek. After these words, the young man decided to leave this place and said goodbye to the defeated enemy, telling him to come to him if he wanted to die. Murup took out a piece of paper from his pocket and thought that one could not worry about mountain caves for a while. His next destination was the demonic forest, the place where his mother was born and raised, but it abandoned them both. The young man was going to the demonic forest in order to become the new successor. He considered it just one of the steps on his way. The demonic forest was located in Sichuan province, which allowed the young man to get one step closer to Murim. This was his main goal. He needed to keep his past a secret. Murup could not believe that an ordinary robber would now become the successor. Half a month later, Murup was already in the demonic forest. Local residents loved him very much because he looked like his mother. The men discussed the young man in a good way. They kept repeating that he has a very kind soul, which is reflected in his eyes. The bald man said that he is absolutely sure that the eyes are the mirror of the soul and they can never deceive them. His interlocutor only laughed at the words that the man blindly believed. Meanwhile, someone overheard their dialogue on the roof. The weather today was sunny and a little windy. The men could not have known that someone was lying on the roof listening to them. It was a long-haired young man who held a blade of grass in his teeth and smiled pleasantly. He liked the dialogue between the 2 men. The young man sat contentedly on the roof and looked directly at the sky, admiring its beauty. He sighed pleasantly from such relaxation. It was Qi Murup who had now become the successor of the demonic forest. Fate gave him such a chance that it would be a sin not to take advantage of it. Suddenly Murup got up from his seat and thought about the fact that he came here, but it is very unusual for him to be the successor. Then the young man turned his head to the left and asked Sona for his opinion on this matter. A bright, pleasant smile shone on his face. Meanwhile, Son climbed up, clinging to the roof. Murup told the boys not to try too hard and offered help. Son said that the man had better climb down himself and not think that by hiding on the roof, he would be able to avoid today's affairs. Having spoken his last word, the boy could no longer hold on to the edge of the roof and let go of his hands, thereby exposing himself to danger. Qin Murup still had to climb down from the roof to help the boy. the warrior confidently stepped forward to his business. He sat Sona behind him and asked him why he needed to climb that roof to cause him a heart attack. Murup asked the boy what was waiting for him today according to the schedules. To begin with, Son thanked the young man for his diligence. Walking through the forest, Son began to tell the plan of the day, according to which the successor had a lecture training and at night also read books about martial arts. Murup did not really like this routine. Son told him that he was the only successor and that was the only reason why he was called. Murup changed the subject and said that the forest looked quite empty now. Son agreed with the interlocutor and said that the forest was quite deserted. But he added that there used to be a lot of people here. He said that all this happened because of the bloody Battle of the Eight, which Murup should have learned about in the lecture. Suddenly the boy jumped off the young man's back as if nothing had ever hurt him. Murup was very surprised by this turn of events. The boy picked with his legs, which did not hurt at all. He was in a great hurry somewhere to be the first from Chin. Son ran up to the old man who was in the arbor and said that he had brought a successor. Murup was surprised how the boy recovered so quickly. The old man invited his successor to him. Murup asked the teacher not to drag out the lecture. The old man laughed and said it looked a lot like his mother. Murup apologized to the teacher but said that his lectures were nonsense. Head Naram Sanhogan just laughed in response. He looked at the young man and said that his mother didn't like the lectures either, but they were very necessary to survive in Murima. Murup took the liver in his hands and asked what it would be about today. The old man was going to tell today about the warriors of Murimu Peak. Murup agreed to listen attentively because he believed that he would have to meet such enemies very often on the way. The old man asked the young man if he had ever heard of the top 10 masters in the world. Murup replied that he would listen. The teacher said that this includes 2 emperors, 3 kings, and 5 dragons. All of them together are called the top 10 masters. The old man added that there is also a holy dragon that was saved by Murim in the Great War and is not included among the 10 great masters. The teacher continued his lecture sipping fragrant tea. He asked his listener if he was even interested. Murup replied that literally every other person knows about it. The old man laughed and said that he was glad that the young man had some knowledge in this field. Then the teacher said that another warrior had recently taken the place of one of the dragons. After these words, Murup spat out the tea he drank. The teacher was forced to wipe his face afterwards. He added that he was the head of the Sanshin pack and was called the Master with 3 arms and 6 legs. He said that this psycho is really elusive and no one can defeat him. His nickname was the Mountain King and he owned all the mountain caves. Chin Murup could not believe what he had just heard with his own ears. He could not put 2 words together and the master was constantly with him. The young man remembered in his head the moment when his opponent in the mountains promised him a place among the 10 best masters in the world. Now he realized that the enemy was not joking and had really given him his place. Chin Murup was simply shocked based on this situation. A little girl was hiding in a cave in a dark, dense forest. Her brother told her to hide in the cave and wait a while. He himself was going to hide in another place. The young man ordered the girl not to leave the cave under any circumstances until the sun rose. Suddenly, the young man began to make strange voices that were looking for the enemy. The boy became very wary and ordered the girl to quickly hide. He himself decided to leave this place so as not to endanger the girl. In the evening, there was a torrential shower, so there were puddles on the ground. The young man entered one of these when he was quickly leaving the cave. He needed to hide from danger as quickly as possible. The guy just ran forward with all his might without even turning his head back. He was very scared and alarmed. He was pursued by a group of soldiers who were armed. They had almost caught up with the boy and were going to grab him immediately. One of the warriors took out a sharp, short knife from his arsenal and threw it in the direction of the little one so that he could not run anymore. A sharp weapon hit the boy's left hand and he cried out in pain. The wound was quite deep and did not allow him to run further. It was deep night on the street and the full moon illuminated the dense forest in which deadly events were taking place. The soldiers stopped the child who was holding his hand. The leader of this gang said that this is an unusual child and a child of Satan. Another warrior said that they had no right to touch children and those who did not study martial arts by order of the Dragon Saint. Taking out his sword, the man replied that it was because of such imprudence that the war started and a very heavy price had to be paid. He turned to his companions and asked if it was not they who had lost their wife and daughter because of this bloody war. The man himself lost his entire family. He didn't want to let the war start again, so he wanted to end the boy. He swung his weapon at the child and said that all the people from the Hidden Valley must die to prevent the second bloody battle of the Eight. Suddenly someone's voice stopped the wrongful actions of the warrior. The man did not understand what was happening and turned his head to the right. He saw in front of him an old grandfather and a young boy standing on a rock. The old man said to drop the matter as the boy was not guilty. The other warriors immediately took notice of the uninvited guests and told them to introduce themselves, asking if they were sometimes from the Hidden Valley. The old man replied that they were not from those parts. After hearing the answer, the soldiers told the guests to go away since this child of Satan is none of their business. The old man said that they had wrong judgments about this war and the Hidden Valley itself did not participate in the war against the Eight. One of the soldiers said that he was hearing about it for the first time and demanded to bring evidence on this account. Another partner said he didn't need any proof. This man believed that the evidence was superfluous in this situation and how much for him the boy was a child of Satan. He was going to kill the kid. Seeing that the boy was in danger, the old man ordered his student to help the little one, and he immediately rushed forward. He named his student Murap. The fighters were shocked at the speed of the little one and prepared to receive attacks from him. Murap moved towards his opponents with lightning speed. They called the boy a devil and began to panic. The warriors continued to shout loudly in surprise and said that the young man was about to use a devilish technique. Murap was not going to do anything like that and went through his enemies painlessly, just taking their weapons. One of the warriors immediately drew attention to the fact that he felt absolutely no pain, but he felt a touch in the area of his waist. Literally in a few seconds, Murap cleared his opponents and took their swords, ordering them to get out of here immediately. He saved the innocent boy and threw the swords to the ground. He once again turned to the soldiers and said that he would not do it twice. The fighters were simply shocked by this turn of events. They looked at this young guy and did not understand how it happened. Two of their warriors immediately decided to leave the battlefield after being left with absolutely no weapons in their arsenal. Only one man was left standing on the battlefield who wanted to kill the child. He was very angry at being disturbed. The man reached behind his back to get the knife. He was not going to retreat and wanted to defeat the uninvited guests. Murap looked directly into the eyes of his potential opponent as if saying that he was watching his every move. The man could not do anything about himself. Despite the age of his potential enemy, he was afraid to engage in battle and trembled. In the end, the last warrior on the battlefield decided to leave his cause. He was extremely displeased but could not do anything. The men who had just wanted to finish off the innocent boy were forced to retreat without weapons in their hands so as not to become victims themselves. Leaving the dense forest, the old man led his student to the slope of one of the mountains to tell him something important. Murap listened attentively. The old man talked about the fact that he once took a boy under his wing who eventually joined a group of 8 and started a war. He asked his young disciple if he was going to do the same. Murap said he would think about it. The teacher called the boy a scoundrel. The old man continued his story and said that he will soon have to go to the other world, so he has one important request for the student. The teacher wanted Murap to help him make money so that the inhabitants of the Hidden Valley could see light before them and not war. He added that thanks to Murap's abilities it is quite possible, although he will have to sweat through the Een seal. The guy offered to just kill that dragon. The teacher explained that such revenge would not end well. The old man decided to name the settlement that his disciple would defend Sanchin. He warned the boy that he too could be a target someday and should be careful. Murap exhaled and agreed with everything. The old man paid attention to the fact that the student was a bit careless and relaxed, so he decided to bring him to his senses with a shout. Now Murap was apologizing to his late master for becoming some kind of mountain king and one of the 10 strongest warriors. He himself did not realize this yet. His teacher, who was lecturing, tried to bring the boy to his senses, waving his hands. Murap remembered his teacher's first pupil, who was the leader of the 8 that started killing people. His name was Huang Unchan. With his techniques, he started the bloody massacre of the 8, which took a lot of lives. And even now, the warriors mercilessly kill the inhabitants of the Hidden Valley. That is why Murap hides his true identity and pretends to be a fool who has no idea what is happening in Murim. The young man cursed his last adversary who had awarded him such glory. At the next meeting, he wanted to tear him to pieces. Finally, the old teacher was able to coax out his student, whose pupils finally moved, and he began to make sounds. The old man asked what happened to the young man. Murap replied that he was simply not feeling well and offered to finish for today. The teacher seemed not to hear the young man and was going to tell one last interesting story. Murap tried to stop the old man, but it was all in vain. In the demonic forest, a meeting was taking place in the Tezen chamber discussing the possibilities of further lessons for the successor. One of those present said that these lessons should not be delayed as they need a successor as soon as possible. It was the head of Naram Sanhogan who suggested that those present immediately proceed to the discussion of the truly important stage of development. Another man laughed at the old man and said that he didn't think he would say a word today. Sanhogan was shocked. The meeting was also attended by the chairman of Urim U. Hassan. He behaved as seriously as possible and watched all the events. He turned to the head of the inner forest and said that even though Murup is the direct successor, he must be a blood descendant. The man doubted whether the young man had the opportunity to take over this title. He considered this the main problem in their conversation. Yu Hassan turned to the head of the chamber and said that none of them perceived the unexpected appearance of this young man as a positive phenomenon. He added that simply accepting it would be unwise. From the expression on the faces of those present, it was clear that they agreed with the man. Yu Hassan suggested first checking the young man's capabilities. Cho Penchen, who was the previous head of the demonic forest, agreed with this. He ordered the head of the outer forest to give his successor a task that would remain a secret even to him. Hassan was somewhat surprised. The man came to the young successor and told him everything that happened. He said that this is why he came to him. Murup immediately understood that he was simply not trusted and said to say everything as it is, he will do everything. Hassan got a little angry with the young man. He said that a place called Chongha Tavern, which is in the northwest of Sichuan province, would have to be returned. Murup asked what was stolen there. Yu Hassan explained that this and the good one used to be ruled by a demonic forest, but then it was taken away by Kolsa's group. Kolsa's group was one of the godless path clans that would stop at nothing. Yu Hassan knew that they were difficult to deal with. Murup asked how this demonic forest fell so low that it was being robbed by all sorts of scoundrels. Yu Hassan was simply shocked by these words. He shouted at the young man and slammed his hand on the table, telling him to watch his words as they were attacked by no ordinary gang. Murup was also not going to remain silent and stood up, saying that someone who was robbed by some ignorant people cannot just shout at him like that. Yu Hassan sat down in his seat and fell silent after this statement of the interlocutor. He understood that it really looked quite strange. Murup immediately apologized for his behavior as he was very sensitive to sounds, and once again questioned the purpose of his task. Yu Hassan confirmed that the tavern should be returned and added that for security purposes he would have to introduce additional security to the young man. Murup slowly left the room and understood that such actions of the man were considered completely dangerous. He wanted to introduce spies to him, not security. Yu Hassan looked askance at the young man and called him an ill-mannered ruffian. He didn't want to have such a successor of the demonic forest. Murup turned to the interlocutor and said that he agreed to complete this task. He asked when it should be done. Hassan replied that the young man had 5 days. He thought about the fact that now the successor will speak completely different words and will not be able to cope with the task. But the man was very surprised when he heard the young man's answers. Murup firmly replied that he did not need the whole 5 days at all. He put 2 fingers up and said that he only needed 2 days and that time would be quite enough for him. The successor's words put Yu Hassan in a stupor, but he reassured himself that it would not be so easy to return the tavern. The young man sat down on the sofa and told the man that he would choose the guards himself as he did not want to be followed. The man said that he was only doing this for the safety of his successor, but thought that the young man was too smart and must have a headache. Murup turned to his side and told the man to leave the room as the warrior needed to rest a bit before the mission. Yu Hassan decided not to disturb the young man and left the room, closing the door behind him. He was not very pleased with the behavior of his successor. The man perfectly understood that he was giving the young man an overly difficult mission, but he could not allow some weak fighter to succeed him. He remembered the moment when Murup denied him and shut his mouth. In Hassan, he noted the young man's stubborn and firm character. Chairman Uerima left the building and went to his home. It was evening outside and the sun was slowly falling below the horizon. Night came and another guest approached Murup, who seemed to be in a hurry. It was another bent man. The head of Naramu burst into the young man's room and shouted loudly. Murup immediately opened his eyes and said that they all got him. The young man got up from the bed and rubbed his eyes. The old man said that he had heard that the head of Urim was here and inquired what he had said. Murup began to yawn at the old man, hinting at a dream. He replied that the man had told him that one should not ask for help from others. The head of Naramu, Sanhogan, knew his colleague's character very well. He assumed that this old man must have given the young man a very difficult task. Then Sanhogan decided to take care of his current disciple and said that the mission could not go beyond the demonic forest. Pouring himself tea, Murup announced that he would choose the security himself and added that the lectures would have to be suspended. Sanhogan perfectly understood that the young man did not like a lecture at such a time, so he agreed. He asked if he really needed help. The young man raised the cup to his mouth and said that if he had already been ordered to do so, he would not do anything, especially since he was in someone else's territory. Song Hogan once again questioned whether the young man would definitely be able to complete the task. Murup only smiled in response to the old man after these words. He asked why talk about it now if nothing has happened yet. The old man was simply shocked by the young man's hypocrisy. He looked at Song Hogan with a pleasant look and continued to smile. He assured him that there was nothing to worry about. Song Hogong became increasingly wary at this moment. He stared at the young man's strange smile and could not understand his intentions. Murup threw a robe on himself and told the old man not to follow him. Song Hogan asked the young man where he was going. Merup wanted to breathe air. The warrior stepped out into the fresh air and headed forward with a smile on his face. It's time to find an adventure for your 5th point. Under the guidance of the full moon, Murup went in search of adventure. He didn't know where he was going, he just wanted to take a walk. Despite the short walk, the young man still took care of his feet and put on shoes as warm as possible. He walked forward and thought that his guide named Son was already asleep due to the fact that very little time had passed since his arrival. The young man stopped in one place and looked straight ahead. Now he realized that the guidebook would certainly not have hindered him. Murup sees only one bamboo in front of us and nothing else. The young man could clearly state that he got lost in the forest. Suddenly the warrior heard strange sounds from the forest which immediately attracted him. It looked like something like a traditional musical instrument. Murup decided to go to the sounds and find a musician. Even before arriving, the young man could appreciate how well the music played. Murup walked through thick thickets, parting the bushes in order to find the musician and come to the sounds of his musical instrument. Finally, the young man came out of the bushes and saw in front of him a man who was sitting on the bank of the river and playing a wonderful melody for the whole forest. The musician held a bandura-like musical instrument in his hands and sang along to the sounds of his melody. The man was absorbed in his song and did not notice anything around him. He just sang a song that was full of love meaning. The musician had no idea that someone could be watching him just up close. Murup was not going to disturb the man. Suddenly Music raised his eyes and saw a stranger in front of him. He immediately stopped singing and lowered his voice. Murup was delighted with the man's music. He didn't say anything, just looked at him with a smile on his face, appreciating the music. The man was simply shocked and after a while stopped playing completely. He was very embarrassed that someone heard him. Murup decided to smooth over the situation around him and told the man that he sings very well, clapping his hands. The young man began to repeat the words of the song and mock its love meaning. The musician was simply outraged by such behavior. Continuing to laugh, the warrior asked the musician what his name was. The man replied that he was Udiha and served in the Black Sword Squad. Murup asked the man what he was doing in the forest late at night. The musician said he was spending his last days as a warrior. Udiha immediately recognized the man everyone had been talking about lately and added that he must not pick up a weapon. Murup asked why. The musician asked the interlocutor what color the moon is now. Murup did not quite understand the question and answered that it was yellow. Udiho only laughed at the man's answer. He behaved quite strangely and without respect for the heir to the throne. He raised his eyes and looked at the interlocutor. He said in a sad voice that he sees everything in black and white. Murup immediately understood that the man had failed his mission because of this. Udiho is pleasantly surprised when the man guessed this. The warrior had revealed in the past that he was the commander of the Black Sword Squad in charge of a special assignment in the demonic forest. The man told someone that everything was fine at first. They were assigned to deal with strangers who invaded the territory of the Northern Division. At some point, because he heard that one of his wards was calling the commander for help, Udiho immediately rushed to help. He quickly finished his battle and headed forward to save one of his charges from danger. The man made a powerful attack called a shard destruction and was able to hit the enemy, saving his ward. But there was one problem. The man did not distinguish colors very well and did not know his wards by face, and the form of the enemy was very similar to theirs. By doing so, Udiho confused the allies with the enemies and inflicted serious wounds on his comrades, and the enemy was able to gain the upper hand. The wards immediately began to shout on the battlefield that it was necessary to retreat because their commander had gone mad and could no longer distinguish anything. The Black Sword Squad was unable to protect the northern unit and retreated. After that, Udiho was demoted, but he was no longer able to hold a sword. The man told all this with sadness in his voice. After finishing his story, he looked up at the sky and thanked his interlocutor for the company. Murup listened attentively to his interlocutor and smiled back at him, so as not to reveal his true emotions at that moment. In fact, Murup did not sympathize with this man at all and considered him a real scumbag who messed up on the full program. The man stood up from his seat and told the interlocutor that the successor of the demonic forest would not be touched here and wished him luck. Murup asked where the man was going. Udiho replied that he did not belong here and that he would rather go somewhere far away to engage in agriculture. Murup asked the man why he was lying, since he still couldn't get the military issue out of his head. Yudiho stopped. He turned his head towards the young man and asked in a serious voice what he meant. Murup asked the interlocutor to give him a sword. Yudiho reached for his weapon and held it out to his interlocutor. Murup took the sword out of its sheath. He shone very brightly. The young man said that for someone who is retiring, the man has too neat and sharp a sword blade. He looked at the man's reflection and said that he was a warrior to the bone because a neat sword is the basis of the martial arts of the demonic forest. Murup hid the sword in its case and watched the man's emotions. He knew that pride would not allow the musician to get involved in battles. The young man asked the man to take him to Jianga's tavern and he would help him. Yudiho once again reiterated his commitment to martial arts. Hearing the man's answer, Murup looked at him with demonic eyes that had no pupil. Yudiho shook at this moment. The young man asked if the man really thought he had no place in the demonic forest. Yudiho answered positively with a trembling voice. Then Murup put his hand on the interlocutor's shoulder and said that in this case a new pleasant place could be found for him. Murup offered the man to unite as an outsider with an outsider. Yudiho was simply shocked by such a proposal. He looked at the confident face of the interlocutor and asked himself if he could change if he followed this carefree young man. In the end, Yudiho decided to accept the proposal of the heir to the throne. You did not go on a journey under the guidance of a full moon, and 2 hours later the fighters were already in the northwest of Sichuan province. The battle inside Jianga Tavern began. Yudiho also participated in this fight and was sweating profusely after it. He saw everything with his own eyes and concluded that Murup won. Suddenly the man turned his head and saw in front of him the motionless body of a young man who fell powerlessly to the ground. Yudiho couldn't believe his eyes and shouted loudly, trying to reach the successor. He did not know what to do in such a situation. 2 hours ago the soldiers were in the city of Chongqing. Yudiho told his successor that this city has 4 exits on different sides. He said that the demonic forest controlled the northeast exit. Murup asked how things were going with the other 3. Yudiho replied that the remaining 3 exits were controlled by the Great Sword Clan or families that had business dealings with the clan. Now Murup understood who and why the demonic forest is so afraid of the godless clan. Turns out that larger fish are introduced into this sea. Muripa was interested in the possibility of carrying out his mission, and he asked if the big match would interfere if he attacked Cole's gang. Yudiho replied that he would intervene if there was a reason, but they also did not want an all-out war as it would lead to heavy casualties. Murup looked at his interlocutor and asked what chance they had of winning the battle against the greatsword. Yudiho replied that it would be an unequivocal defeat as the scale of the fighting force was impressive. The warriors of the godless clan are on the side of the great sword. Murup said that then they simply did not need to give a reason to attack. Yudiho asked the successor what he was going to do. The young man replied that they were going to enter a small institution. He meant the tavern he was going to pocket. Murup told his partner to go for a walk in the market and he would make a little noise here. Yudiho was simply shocked by such a decision. The young man approached the front door and ordered the interlocutor not to go inside under any circumstances as he had a reason to do so. Yudiho was forced to agree with his current partner. He couldn't understand his train of thought and assumed he had a plan. Meanwhile, a relaxing atmosphere reigned in the tavern. The men laughed loudly at the whole institution and constantly drank, lifting the mood. Suddenly their fun was interrupted by the next event, and they immediately turned their gaze to the door where the mysterious stranger had entered. Murup confidently headed to the parade and asked him to bring a bottle of something flammable and a bite to eat. Those present did not like it. One of the men rose from his seat and asked the stranger to wait. Murup stopped and turned his head towards the man. He asked the young man if he was new here as he had not been seen here before. Murup replied that he was passing through. All attention was focused on the young man, to whom they decided to explain the rules in the tavern. The man said that at such a time seats are reserved in a slightly different way. This man was the leader of Kulsa's gang named Muban. He continued his conversation with the stranger and asked him to show his wallet. Murup closed his eyes for a second and thought about the fact that these bastards do not know how to communicate in any other way, and even more so to rest. He looked at the interlocutor with a sinister look and asked him when they would already gorge themselves on their money and booze. After these words, the leader of the Kulsa gang was very angry with the uninvited guest and decided to teach him a lesson with his fist. The blow came straight to Murup's face, but he was not going to resist it. It was part of his cunning plan. One of the gang members caught the young man and said that he could not even dodge. Murup ordered to release him immediately. After that, the robber threw the victim towards the leader. Murup planned everything so that the great sword would have no reason to interfere. It's as if he just went to a tavern for a drink and the Coles gang did violence to him for no reason. The young man's nose was injured. Yudiho stood outside the door and listened. He had heard rumors of a successor who knew martial arts, but Yudiho decided that he was even stronger. At that moment, the central door of the inn was broken and one of the bodies flew out. The warrior was simply shocked by this turn of events. Yudiho stuck his head forward to look inside the inn. He began to search with his eyes and call Murup, but what the man saw before his eyes simply shocked him. His eyes literally almost fell out of their sockets. He saw in front of him robbers flaunting their blows. Some of them said that they hadn't had so much fun in a long time. Yudiho didn't understand what was happening at all. Suddenly his attention was drawn to a body that flew out of the inn during the fight. Cole's supporters continued to flaunt their strength, and Yudiho turned his head back to recognize the injured body. Looking closely, the man saw Murup's body lying motionless on the floor in front of him. The young man looked insignificant. Then Yudiho realized that the successor did not win at all, but on the contrary lost. His facial expression conveyed his inner state. The man immediately ran up to the successor and lifted him up. Murup spat blood from his mouth and said that the great sword would definitely not intervene. Then Yudiho remembered the words of the successor who spoke about the reason for the attack. Now the puzzles in his head were piled up. The man realized why his successor had brought him with him. The robbers decided that it was a scoundrel from the demonic forest who didn't even know how to use a sword. Suddenly one of them heard a man calling the young man his successor. They didn't believe it was him because he was too weak. Yudiho asked the robbers if they even knew who they had just beaten. Coles could not believe that the man was telling the truth. Yudiho looked towards the bandits and said that it was absolutely true, and this young man was indeed the successor of the demonic forest. Chin Murup finished his task and returned to the ward. He completed his task in such a way that he did not even have to fight the bandits. The young man had been beaten for no reason, and now Coles was forced to apologize to the demonic forest on his knees. Coles' gang remained in great debt to the demonic forest, and there was no reason for the great sword to intervene. Murup hired an actor to play the doctor and give him fatal diagnoses. Murup himself was lying in bed and pretending to be injured. Coles continued to stand on his knees and sweat. At some point, one of those present addressed him in a serious and angry voice. It was the head of the chamber who was very furious. He said that they searched all over China to find a successor. The chairman wanted to destroy the entire Coles gang right now, but said that in this situation the opinion of the victim himself was important. Murup, with tears in his eyes, said that he was sorry that he allowed himself to be beaten by a gang of bandits and tarnished the honorable name of the demonic forest. He turned to the other side and added that rumors of this massacre had already spread throughout Chongqing, and he did not know how to live on. The young man said that he just wanted to go to the next world. After these words, the chairman of the chamber became even more angry and was going to make a final decision. Coles was very frightened and did not know what to do in this situation. He asked the master not to do anything with him and admitted his guilt. Looking at those present, the bandit said that he could not bring everything back, but he could at least pay for the successor's treatment. The head did not like such redemption. Covering himself with his hands, the bandit said that in this case you can ask him anything. At this moment, Hassan began to guess about Murup's cunning plan. He could not believe that the young man had decided to go to such extremes. The man glanced at his successor, who was lying helplessly on the bed and pretending to be sick, but he really wasn't. Murup showed his eyes to Hassan, and they did not look pitiful. The young man's face seemed very insidious at the moment their eyes met. Hassan perfectly understood what exactly and how he wanted to achieve the young man, but he thought that he had no pride at all. Murup told his abuser to give him the tavern. Coles immediately agreed to such a proposal from the victim. The bandit thought that he even made a profit by making the successor a cripple and selling the tavern at a declining price. He brought money with him for treatment and realized that he managed to sell his tavern for less than the amount he brought. Suddenly, Murup told the application to leave money for treatment. Coles was not very happy about this and asked if one tavern was not enough. Murup looked at his accuser with pitiful eyes. He did not expect such an answer from him and decided that something should be done about it. The young man turned aside and said that it was better to kill himself. Then Coles immediately shouted that he would leave the money just so that the young man did not die. The anger of the head of the chamber was very great for the bandit. But by some miracle he managed to leave alive, leaving the money and the tavern. Coles hastily left the chamber so that the chairman would not change his decision. He felt very first after this meeting. The bandit sat down helplessly on the ground and did not know what to do next. He went to a terrible death because of this ridiculous situation. The head of the chamber turned to the successor and said that he could become disabled. He asked why he had come to that tavern in the middle of the night. Murup, with a smile on his face, answered that he wanted to drink a couple of glasses and added that his disability is all acting. After hearing the young man's answers, the head of the ward asked the successor if the head of Urim had really ordered him to return the Jianga tavern. Yu Hassan was going to answer first and admit his rationality. But he was suddenly interrupted by Murup, who denied everything. Hearing these words from the young man, Urim's head was simply shocked. He did not know how to react to such a turn of events. Murup looked at the head of the ward and answered with a smile on his face that his task was to change people's opinion about himself. Yu Hassan simply could not believe his ears. He looked towards the successor of the demon forest with some wariness and shock. Udeho was also in the meeting room and silently observed everything. He was satisfied with the next development of events. Chairman Naramu also listened attentively to everyone present. He perfectly understood what punishment Yu Hassan could suffer for his actions. The head of the chamber turned to the man whom he entrusted to give the task to the successor and asked if he had fulfilled his mission. Yu Hassan replied that it was very difficult for him to understand the methods of carrying out the successor's mission. Those present doubted his words. The man added that as much as he needed to change his opinion about himself, the young man completed the task. Murup left the meeting chamber. When the young man was about to leave the building, Yu Hassan stopped him. Murup turned his head and asked what the old man needed. Chairman Waramu could not connect two words and was very worried. Murup began to push him and told him to speak faster. Yu Hassan asked why the young man put aside his pride just to complete the task. Murup asked what was wrong with their pride. Yu Hassan replied that pride was the decisive factor for survival in Mirima. Murup only smiled mischievously at the old man in response. He told the old man to wrap up his mustache, that when a person wants to achieve something, he even has to wallow in the mud sometimes. The young man turned to the head of Urim and asked why he had not yet taken the inn from some scum thanks to his pride. The old man could not find anything to answer the young man. Udeho was simply shocked by the arrogant behavior of the successor, but he agreed with him. Chin Murup added that it is better for the old man not to think about pride but about his real enemy who is sitting right in front of his nose. He was referring to the Great Sword Squad. After these words, the successor turned his back to the old man and set off with his partner. Yu Hassan saw off the soldiers with a glance. He understood that the young man was asking him to put aside his pride, but he did not understand why he would follow such a difficult path. He looked at the young man and thought that people wouldn't take him seriously after he let himself be spanked. Hassan ultimately had no choice and would have to work hard to win the favor of his successor. Another head approached him. He began the dialogue with words about good weather. Yu Hassan immediately ordered the head Naram to get out of his sight. The old man laughed back. Evening has come in Chongqing, which lies in the province of Sichuan. People slowly dispersed to their homes. In one of the taverns, those present thanked the Kanim for a widely laid table. They appreciated his job well done. This man accepted the praise from the men and told them to stop licking at last. He began to discover something. It was the bottle of booze everyone was looking forward to. The men wanted a drink, but the Henim refused them. It was a man of Ronin status named Mug Yingpi. He looked at his treasure and was surprised that the Godless Path clan had started trading. One of the people present said that the Great Sword clan did not pay attention to such things. Mug Yingpi replied that he didn't care if there was something to drink. Ronin added that they had cover and no one would pick on them. Suddenly the dialogue was interrupted by a bald man who burst into the inn. Mug Yingpi heard the cries of the man who was calling for him. He turned his gaze to the left to look at him. The man ran as fast as he could to tell the gentleman the news that was supposed to literally knock him off his feet. A big trouble happened. The herald went to the table where the Henim was sitting and took hold of his drink. He said he wanted a drink. Mug Yingpi was in shock. The man began to drink this expensive drink and others tried to stop him. However, the herald paid no attention to anyone. Mug Yingpi was very angry at the uninvited guest who interrupted his rest, but he still dared to drink a drink. Those present informed the man that this alcohol was obtained through blood during a shopping trip. Lysi immediately started apologizing. They continued to be angry with him and promised to rip open his stomach if it was the will of the Chenim himself who owned the alcohol. Suddenly, this man's speech was interrupted by someone's strong hand falling on his head. The man turned his head to the side. It was Mug Yingpi, who was shocked and angry. He pushed the man aside and told everyone not to interrupt him. Seeing the fury of the Chenim, the messenger realized that he might not be able to say hello. Ronin addressed him as Hiktu. Mug Yingpi stood up to his full height and looked at Hikta, telling him that if he blew the elephant's fly, he was hooked. Hiccup was very frightened and was still shaking when he started to speak. He asked if the Hyenim remembered Cho Yiren from the demonic forest. Mug Yingpi clarified whether this was the same woman who disappeared 30 years ago. Hiccup replied that he was continuing to sweat. The Ronin looked at the messenger with a serious look and said that he would not be able to forget this woman, who is the daughter of Cho Pyeongkon. The man remembered her extraordinary beauty and added that if she hadn't died from heavenly In Sichuan might have been different. Hiktu confirmed every word Henim said and moved on to the main news. He reported that the son of this woman appeared in the demonic forest. Mug Yingpi could not believe the messenger. He asked how a woman with such a disease was able to give birth to a healthy child. Hiktu replied that it was completely true and the demonic forest was in turmoil right now, although according to the man the successor would not help them. Mug Yingpi looked into the man's eyes and asked if the successor possessed martial arts. The herald replied that he did not know this. Henim was very angry after receiving this news. He grabbed the weapon, thereby scaring Hikta. The herald began to make excuses and begged the Lord for mercy since he was not guilty of anything and conveyed what he had heard. Mug Yingpi walked past the man with the weapon in hand and told him to relax. Hiccup could exhale. The Ronin was asked where he was going, to which the man replied that he needed to repay the Greatsword clan. Mug Yingpi set off on his way. The idea of a successor did not leave him. Now the Ronin were covered by the influential Greatsword clan. Due to the fact that there was no successor in the demonic forest, the Greatsword was considered the master of the province, but suddenly Cho Yiren's son appeared. Mug Yingpi thought that if the young man inherited his mother's genes and also mastered martial arts, then he became a true master. The man walked forward and couldn't understand just one thing: how such a master could get kicked by Cole's gang. He guessed for sure that this was not the end of the story and that everything was not clean here. Ronin was going to deal with everything on his own. Meanwhile, a meeting was held in the Tezen chamber. As always, the heads of all the districts of the demonic forest were present at it. The head of the demonic forest finally appeared at the gathering, in whose absence many interesting and dangerous events took place. Cho Mugon sat in the center of the table and said that he had been told all the news on the way. He immediately inquired about Murup's well-being. The successor sat at the other end of the table. He replied that everything is fine and apologized for the inconvenience. Yu Hassan immediately decided to take the blame. Cho Mugon raised his hand and said that he was not going to punish anyone. The head of the demonic forest turned to head Naram and asked if he had found a suitable place for Murup. The old man raised his finger and said that he had found it. He proposed the temple of Piso but was immediately rejected. The man opposite said that his temple would not be suitable for the successor. He did not want to listen to anything else and said that there were no seats. Those present went through many temples and departments, but they could not come to a common opinion on who would take his successor. Cho Mugon understood that no one wanted to take Murup in because he was beaten by a gang of robbers. Suddenly someone suggested an idea. It was Urim's head. Mugon asked what he wanted to say. The man proposed to create a separate institution for the successor. He cited the Northeast Bureau as an example. This idea did not immediately appeal to Chief Naram, as he knew the background. In the past, the demonic forest occupied a prime position in Sichuan province, and the southeastern city of Chongqing flourished. However, when the power of the demonic forest weakened in the province, the Northeast Bureau was the only body left. The head of Naramu looked at his face and thought that he wanted to set up his successor again, putting him in danger. V. Gason was asked if there was still a sales outlet on that side. The man replied that it was Jianga Tavern, which had been returned by the successor. After these words, Narama's head could no longer hold back. He menacingly asked why the man wanted to spite his successor. Ugason said that was not the point. Chairman Naramu replied that it was because of his stupid task that the successor almost died. Looking at the glass on the table, Wu Hassan said that he admitted his mistake because he thought that the successor would not accept such actions. But the result turned out to be completely different. In Hassan, he recognized the successor and was even able to see great potential in him. Udeho, a colorblind warrior, was also present at the meeting. He was pleasantly surprised by the words of praise towards Murup. Yu Hassan continued to stand his ground and said that a place where he can lead independently would suit his successor. The man bowed his head to the head of the demonic forest and said that if Murup went to the bureau, he would give him his warriors. Murup watched this conflict with a smile on his face. He admitted that Urim's head was not so boring anymore. Cho Mugon asked Wu Hassan if he could imagine the consequences of his proposal. The man replied that he was aware of the challenge to the Great Sword. He said that they have the same number of masters. Therefore, some action must be taken to restore the demonic forest to its former glory. Yu Hassan added that he could fully entrust the future of the demonic forest to his successor. Chief Naramu could not believe his ears. The head of the demonic forest asked the successor himself for his opinion. They immediately began to whisper advice to him to refuse. Two men were looking at him from the left side who said that one disgrace was enough and there was no need to make too much noise. Murup asked the head to repeat his question once more because he did not hear him because of some bad advice from the side. The men were unhappy with the young man's behavior. Murup really was as unpredictable as possible even for his own people. The successor was warned that the clans located near the Northeast Bureau were allies of the Great Sword clan. The young man immediately understood that if these clans were provoked, the Great Sword would definitely interfere in this intraprovincial conflict. The head confirmed and added that their strength is greater, but if you subjugate some of the eastern clans, then the imbalance will even out a little. Cho Murag looked at the young man and waited for his answer. He understood that the pressure from the Great Sword would continue day by day. Murup smiled and confidently answered that he agreed to such a thing. There was fire in his eyes and a thirst for change. However, the young man refused to work. His decision stunned literally everyone present who did not understand the successor. Yu Hassan explained to the young man that this would be a more difficult task than the tavern, so this time he really had better always take his bodyguard with him. The head of the demonic forest agreed with Wu Hassan and recommended that the successor accept the offers with protection. However, Murup was not going to bend and said that he did not need additional protection. Udiho was also shocked. There was nothing Cho Mugon could do. He said that Murup is as stubborn as iron. Chairman Narima agreed with this. After looking at those present, Murup concluded that no one trusted him, but he didn't care. He was about to go. The successor was not bothered by any unpleasant fact from his move. He said that he would return to the ward the very next time. And approaching the door, he added that this time would come precisely when he would capture the Northwest for his possessions. The two people were talking in the room at night about Jianga Tavern and the mysterious events that had started happening recently. It was Mug Yingpi who was informed that the successor of the demonic forest had returned the tavern without weapons so that they could not interfere. The interlocutor opposite closed the book and added that he had never seen the successor but already felt a connection between them. It was the successor of the Great Sword named John Wagi. He said that he was looking forward to meeting Chin Murup. Chin Murup again went to the bamboo forest in search of adventure. This time he felt more confident in the area. Suddenly he heard some strange noises around him, but he assumed that it could be. He asked if it wasn't Jin Huan at times. Behind the successor of the demonic forest, a man with a weapon behind his back landed and confirmed the young man's guesses. The warrior wore a black mask and hid his face. He introduced himself as Seo Jin Huan, the head of a secret squad from Songkan. Murup warned his charge not to come here as they were being watched, perhaps even now. Jin Huan admitted his guilt but could not leave the king alone. He asked the young man for permission to follow him. Murup called the man stubborn as a donkey, smiled, and asked where he lost his squad on the way. Jin Huan replied that the warriors were waiting outside the walls of the fortress to be able to immediately spring into action in case of need. Murup told the ward to prepare a place for the warriors to spend the night, but Jin Huan objected that they might be exposed. The successor of the demonic forest said that no one would venture that far. Jin Huan agreed to carry out the order, but that was not all the man wanted to say. He looked at his king and asked him for some more attention. Jin Huan took notice of his king's height. The young man replied that his guesses were correct and that he had indeed almost stopped growing. He added that when the growth was complete, he would be able to use the energy that the master had sealed inside him. Murup decided to give his ward one more task since he was already in these lands. Jin Huan waited impatiently for the master's words to continue. He was loyal to his king and completed any task. The allies continued their conversation in the bamboo forest. Murup provided a task for the ward and he agreed. Murup finally went to the northeast of the province where after that things went up at a rapid pace. The heads of Urim and Narim financially supported the successor and the Chongha tract had a new life after the Kolsa gang. A muscular man in the tavern greeted the successor on his arrival. He was definitely in a slightly elevated mood. There were two of these men, and they said that they were ready to serve the successor both day and night throughout their lives. The Northeast provided the workforce in the form of muscular chefs. One of them was called Puge, and the other Adan. He was a waiter. Murup greeted the new staff after a long absence. He asked them to prepare something quickly. The cheerleaders immediately ran to fulfill the whim of their new boss. With such thugs, no one will rob the inn for sure. Daiko asked his successor what he was reading. Murup replied that it was a book describing the situation in the Northwest. The young man learned that there are many gangs in these parts. Diho added that Kolsa's gang and Muva are here for trade. Other gangs earn money through transportation and transportation. Murup gave an interesting welcome to the page about the Coles gang. Meanwhile, a delicious lunch in the form of noodles was brought to the successor's table. The smell immediately spread throughout the restaurant. Murup read that the gangs of Kulsa and Muva did not get along and asked Diho what he thought was the reason. The man replied that they were competing with each other to stay afloat and continue to cooperate with the Greatsword clan. Murup started eating noodles. At the same time, he had a dialogue with his mentor and said that he was saying everything correctly. Ratpalm, one idea came to the successor. He turned his head towards Diho and asked the man. He said he was going to have to be an errand boy for a while. Diho was shocked and did not understand anything. Meanwhile, Chola's gang was hanging out at the Godless Path clan and drinking. Their toasts echoed one after the other. The last toast was made by the head of the Kulsa gang named Yuk Muban. He was holding a bottle in his hands and was about to drink to bankruptcy. Suddenly, a man entered the inn and informed the master that they had come to him from the demonic forest. Muban was not satisfied. The herald reassured the chief and added that the guest had come with a gift. Muban replied that it was a completely different matter. The leader of the Kulsa gang said to let the guest in because he wanted to look at the gift. The ward went to let the guest in. Diho heard these words and decided to come in uninvited. He greeted the owner and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Muban immediately recognized the shepherd who was next to the successor of the demonic forest and asked what he needed. Diho gave the box and said that the successor had ordered the gift to be given to the leader of the Kulsa gang. The ward took the gift. He immediately took the box to the head and he opened it. Looking inside, the man was very surprised at what he saw. They were fried cakes that the successor had sent as a gift in honor of the opening of the new tavern of Chongha. Muban was very angry and said that he did not need these cakes and that the tavern had ruined his whole life. Diho turned his back to the interlocutor and said that this was all he had. He promised to come back again tomorrow. Deko really gave the cakes and just left. Muban turned to his ward named Tebin and asked him to follow the guest. The leader of the gang felt something unclean and did not want a guest to come here every day, so he ordered to watch him. Tebin had been following the man in red all week. He was a master of tracking and a local heartthrob. He had been watching Diho for quite some time and noticed that he was taking rice cakes from the market and immediately going to Coles. During all the time Tebin was watching, he managed to learn almost nothing except that the man likes cakes. All the while, Dejo bought only tortillas and Tebin decided not to offend himself either. He really liked them with bean paste. He told all this to his boss. Muban was simply shocked by what he heard. His ward did nothing but eat. Tebin replied that these words were offensive to him because he was gathering information. And now only rumors spread through the city. Tebin said that people began to think that Cole's gang was now friends with the demonic forest. Muban asked why. The ward explained that the man in red visited them every day and the Muva gang decided that it was a direct alliance. And then she spread the rumor that they were friends. Muban was simply shocked to learn such news. His eyes rolled onto his forehead. Muban was very angry and shouted at the whole inn. His screams about killing Chin Murup could be heard in the street. Meanwhile, Murup sat quietly in his inn. Deko asked the young man if it was necessary to carry the cakes again today. Murup replied that there was no need for this anymore since people definitely suspected something and started spreading rumors. Meanwhile, Muban was on his way to revenge. Murup did everything to ensure that the Coles gang could not continue its existence. As soon as the successor mentioned the head of the gang, he burst into his premises, kicking open the door. Murup smiled at the guest and told his cooks Puge and Adan to bring him drinks. Muban said he was definitely not a guest here. Murup told the man to sit down or his red face would soon crack. The leader of Kulsa's gang approached the successor's table and broke it with his foot, asking if the young man knew why he had come. Murup looked into the man's eyes and smiled mischievously, assuming that he had come to the inn to drink a glass. Muban could not contain his anger at being taken for a fool. He said that he does not need to be fooled and that he knows everything. The man said that now the successor will start to fear him. Murup's wards were ready to help Mr. Murup asked why this man did not want to drink with him. Muban replied that he would rather break the bottle on his successor's head. Then the young man decided that he had nowhere to go and got up from his seat. He turned to his subordinate with a request. The young man told De to close all the windows and doors as the working day was over and ordered the cooks to go to the kitchen. Muban asked with a sneer why he was so ostentatious because he must not forget how he got the devils last time. Murup advised the one cleaning up the mess behind the big sword to shut up and headed for the door. Muban asked why the young man was running away. Murup said he would like to run away but not today. Diho was wary after that as he understood what the dialogue was leading to. The successor stopped at the door and said that once upon a time it was believed that a person's character was formed by his manners. He slowly put his hand to the lock and closed the door. Diho realized that his worst assumptions had come true. Murup turned to face the guest and rubbed his fists. He said that he would be happy to fulfill his guest's request. Muban began to laugh at the young man and his threats. He offered him attacks first to be sure to be crippled. The leader of the bandits did not have time to blink as the enemy was already in front of him and said that he was already here. Muban was simply shocked by this turn of events and tried to run away from the confrontation with the successor of the demonic forest. However, it was already too late. Murap put his hand forward and firmly grabbed the opponent's face. Deiko was also shocked by the successor's movements. He could not even trace how he approached the robber. Murap held the bandit's face and ordered him to be silent, otherwise he would kill his entire gang without even blinking an eye. The northwest of Sichuan province was divided between supporters of the Great Sword. The local area was considered wild. The gangs here directly interacted with each other. The Godless clan was the most extraordinary in all of Sichuan province. To be worthy of cooperation with a great sword, one must prove one's strength, and those who did not have this strength were destroyed. Among people there were those who managed to survive not only thanks to strength but also cleverness. One of these was a man from Kulsa's gang, Yuk Muban. Udiho looked at Murap's abilities and could only compare them to one person. But Yuk Muban could do nothing. He suffered from a flurry of blows from the enemy and could not even counterattack. His face became like a ball. Deho just watched this with wide eyes. He didn't understand how one of the strongest warriors couldn't block. He remembered the young man's dialogue with the head of Unim. Deho understood that the successor's plans and ambitions would become a reality with such power. Despite all his strength, Murap hid it and endured the abuse that was inflicted on him that night in the inn. Murap no longer felt like a victim in the same building. He literally mocked his opponent. Yuk Muban couldn't do anything at such a speed. He barely noticed the movement of the threshold with his half-open eye. At some point, the man got tired of being bullied and got angry at the opponent swinging his fist at him. Muban countered with a powerful blow, but Murap easily dodged it with just one step to the right. After that, the young man again grabbed the opponent by the face and blocked his breathing through the oral cavity. He began to squeeze the robber's face in his left hand with all his might. Muban tried to scream and beg for mercy. Murap was as calm and reserved as possible. He addressed the enemy in a cold, quiet voice. The young man repeated once more, looking into his eyes, that if the robber screamed, he would destroy all of his sixes. Muban had no choice but to accept this. His mouth literally couldn't exist on its own at this point. He couldn't even imagine that the enemy's attacks would be so strong. The man felt that he would not be able to hold on for long. Murap's skills were far superior to Muban's. The bandit was on his knees and decided to surrender to tell everything to the Great Sword. Suddenly, the successor released the bandit and ordered Deho to follow him. The ward asked where the young man was going. Murap replied that he was going to destroy Cole's gang for not fulfilling the conditions. Muban was dripping with sweat at this moment. He looked at the successor's demonic figure and was simply shocked. He understood that the young man would not be joking. Then the man decided to take the next step. He apologized and admitted defeat to save the gang members. Deho turned to his successor and informed him that he was being too loud and needed to calm down a bit. Murap raised his head to where the people were and agreed with his partner. He added that the robber must be lucky. Murap agreed to spare Cole's gang, for which Muban was immensely grateful, continuing to kneel. He fell on the floor and continued to thank the master for his kindness. Muban sank to the lowest level of pride. Murap decided that the head of Coles could afford to treat him and asked his cooks to organize a dinner for them. The successor of the demonic forest looked at the enemy lying on the ground and said that he was treating him today. Muban was not very happy with this ending. Tears appeared in his eyes and he mentally called his successor. After a few minutes, Puge and Adan organized a wide table. Murap invited his cooks to join as well. The successor said that they had something to talk about and motioned to sit down and not spoil his good mood. The wards were somewhat shocked by their master's decision. This was especially noticeable in Deho's facial expression. In the end, they sat down at a wide table and Murap thanked everyone for their presence. The young man asked for attention to his next words. He started talking about his abilities that he had to hide, and it was related to the demonic forest. He wished that everything that happened today would remain a secret and the head of Yuk would just come to him for a drink. He asked the bandit if he could keep his mouth shut. The man folded his hands together and promised to be a grave. Murap offered to have fun but noticed that something was bothering Deha. The warrior asked the young man if he was really a thief. Murap raised his head proudly and asked how the man even dares to call him a thief after this situation. Immediately, the demonic forest successor ordered Yuku's head to fall to the floor. Muban immediately accepted the thrust, lying down. Then the young man asked Deha who he really thought he was. The man replied that he considered his mentor to be completely evil. Murup suggested asking Yuk's opinion and asked him if he thought the successor was the thief. Yuk Muban stood in a pose on his hands and thought that the young man was just a smelly dung and cattle that was wrangling a successor. But he replied that he was not a thief because he had spared him. Murup allowed Yukov to take his seat. Diha watched everything. Murup explained to Diha that martial arts are a tool for killing and everyone uses them differently, so arguing about good and evil is stupid. The young man said that there are people in the world who are forced to hide all their lives because they have the roots of those who are going to be killed. He gave the example of a child he met many years ago. She managed to avoid being killed by a miracle, and it's all because of her roots. Those present listened attentively as the successor said that for him the art of fighting is survival, and if you are dead there is little point in kindness or malice. Diha folded his hands as a sign of respect and said that he would submit to the master, and in his mind, he thought about what kind of life the young man had lived. Murup looked at the injured head of the bandit who was nodding and said that he was right and we should start having fun immediately. It was the only thing that could make Yuk happy, booze. He caught himself thinking that he was only living for her sake. The bandit laughed loudly and said that now he was definitely happy. Meanwhile, they were watched by a man who could not understand what the interlocutors were talking about so cheerfully. He realized that the rumors might indeed be true and the Coles gang had chosen an alliance with the demonic forest instead of the Great Sword Clan. The scout left the roof of the inn and was going to inform his people that the successor of the demonic forest and the leader of the Kolsa gang had formed an alliance. Murup heard something stir on the roof. Diha asked the young man where he was looking and what was the reason for it. He said that there was a rat on the roof, but it escaped because of Yuk's laughter. The young man offered to continue drinking and they clinked glasses. Murup asked Yuk where he learned to drink like that. The bandit replied that he was one of the best drinkers in the Godless clan. Suddenly Murup offered to invite the Northwestern Alliance for a drink. This made Yuk spit out his drink back. The bandit thought that he heard and asked again. Murup's cook was full of alcohol. The young man himself wanted to learn more about the alliance. Yuk reported that they are meeting with members of the alliance and drinking. This happens about once a month. While drinking, Murup asked when the next meeting would be. Yuk replied that the last one was 10 days ago, so the next one is not soon. Putting a glass on the table, Murup confidently said that there would soon be a meeting of the Northwestern Alliance and told to call him. Yuk replied that the meeting could be postponed if nothing happened and then we would have to wait quite a long time. Murup smiled wickedly and accepted the information. He said it would be a special case for which he had a plan. The young man assured that something will definitely happen soon. An elderly man was heading down the path with a gun on his belt. He was a real warrior, so he immediately noticed that he was being followed and told his abusers to appear immediately. A spy with long blonde hair immediately appeared on the roof. The man below stood and watched the young man. It was the same head of the secret squad named Jinhuan. He went on this mission on Murup's order. He turned to the fourth head of the northwestern part of the province named Quan Hakebek and announced that he would go with him. Jinhuan said that it was a normal painless mission, and if the man behaved well, he would even set him free. Quan Hakebek immediately realized who had stolen the remaining heads of the alliance. He assumed that it was not usually a gang but professionals. That is why the chairman hired two-headed sword masters at his disposal and told them to appear right now. He informed the enemy that the technique of the two brothers was similar to a divine sword. But one of the brothers didn't look good. The same could be said about the other brother. The man saw them in front of him and was simply shocked. They had already been caught and defeated by a man who said that he did not even notice the strength of these famous brothers whom he held by the collars. It was a member of Enchu's secret squad. He turned to the vice chairman and said that he was late because his mercenaries were incapacitated. Quan Hai Bek couldn't believe that Sichuan's best swordsman had been defeated. The man was ordered to shut up if he did not want to be in their company. The old man got angry and charged into the battle, saying that no one could talk to the vice chief of the great sword like that. However, Enchu was prepared for this. He met the enemy with a powerful blow, the speed of which the man could not keep up with. Quan Hai Bek did not expect such a turn of events, but there was nothing he could do. He fell to the ground and lost consciousness. Jin Huan wasn't too surprised by his ward's behavior. He asked him to be a little more restrained. And Chu asked why they couldn't just kill everyone in this great sword since no one here was capable of anything. Jin Huan replied that the king had his own plans. He said that he would figure it out himself, and Enchu ordered to go to the master. The young man asked the big man if he had forgotten how to address the king. Enchu replied that he would now be a Ranin, and their master is now the successor. The man took off his mask and showed the sinister smile of a real thief. He was pleased that he would finally meet the Lord and be able to tell him how he had grown up and what he had achieved. Jin Huan stopped his charge and told him to turn his face towards him. The young man had certain complaints. He looked at the big man's face and asked him to narrow his smile a little, so that it wouldn't scare people at night. 2 days later, Chu arrived at the place where the commander ordered him to go. He sat at the same table with his king and looked at him. Murup did not want to believe that this particular man had come. In a fairly short period of time, he already got him to death. Chu was not distinguished by intellectual abilities and conducted himself quite primitively. He kept repeating the word successor. Murup decided to ask the man one question: why it was Chu who came to his warehouse out of all possible squads. The warrior replied that no one knew him in Sichuan, so he was ordered to appear here. He asked if it was possible for him to turn back. Murup said that there is no need to return if he has already arrived. Ngu asked the successor who else he needed to soak. Murup looked at the ward with a serious look and said that for now there is no need to wet anyone and not to take even a step without his permission. Ngu did not feel very comfortable in such an environment. Thanks to his intellectual abilities, the man could not understand anything. Ngu asked why the young man called him if there were no enemies. Murup slapped his hands on his face out of hopelessness. He replied to the man that he was calling anyone, but he was the one leaning back. Ngu tried to strain his brain and understand it. Murup could no longer tolerate this stupidity and grabbed his head with his hands. He thought that literally in a minute his roof would come off. The successor pounded his hand on the table and told the ward to lose his strength as the dogs from Chokshul should soon be resting. Murup went to the front door and called his wards back. Diha asked the young man who had come to him. The successor replied that he was a Ronin from Shangxi who had come to him for an important reason. At that moment, a supporter of Cole's arrived at the inn. It was the same assistant who accepted cakes from Diho. He greeted his successor, catching his breath after the journey. The man could not say a word because he was very tired on the way here. He wanted to say something about the Northwest Alliance. Finally, the herald said that the Northwest Alliance was calling for a concilium. Murup was very pleased with this news. He turned his head to Chu and told him to get ready as the meeting with the Chokshul hounds was about to take place. Chu was even more pleased than his king. The only thing he loved in this life was punching people in the face. The concilium took place in Sichuan province in the northwest. For this, a structure called Chong'an Fortress was chosen. This place was under the control of one of the 6 gangs, which was the most influential. The gang was called Saka. Yuk Muban, head of the Kolsa gang, also arrived at the meeting. He thought about what the successor was up to, as he had not seen such a rush for a long time. Yuk ordered his men to wait in place because he understood that it would be very difficult to talk to people after the rumors about the demonic forest. Yuk felt that he was on a bad account but decided to reassure himself that the head of the Muva gang was not a gift either. The man ordered to open the door to the meeting hall for him. He had a plan to destroy everyone if he was branded a traitor. Having entered the meeting hall, Yuk looked in front of him and saw that everyone had already arrived, only he was left. At the table sat all the heads of the godless clans that formed the Northwestern Alliance. All the men focused their attention on Yuk. He was immediately approached by the head of the Mua gang, Chu Kwandu. He pointedly asked if the man should now lick the demonic forest's ass. Yuk replied just as sharply that there is one rat here who spreads rumors and he will definitely find him to destroy. Those present, although they did not really respect the last guest, nevertheless feared him. Chu Kwandu mentally provoked the man. Yuk continued to conflict with his direct rival. He thought that the head of the Mua gang must surely be the first victim. The head of Saka's gang, Suk Kimjong, entered the dialogue. He stopped the conflict and said that he would not tolerate such behavior in his tavern. Suk Kimjong suggested that we start a meeting and deal with this problem later. Yuk could breathe a sigh of relief. One of the people present asked Mr. Sok why he gathered everyone before the appointed date, since it had not happened before. The leader of the gang, Saka, said that today he saw great sword soldiers walking down the street and decided to find out what was going on. It turned out that the 6 heads of the great sword were missing. Those present were simply shocked by such news and could not believe it. Yuk Muban was the most shocked of those present. Now he understood what the successor's demonic smile meant and what his intentions were. Others drew attention to the man's strange reaction. Yuk tried to draw attention away from himself and said that he was just very surprised. A discussion began at the table. Yuk Muban was still thinking about what the successor had said to him with something special in mind. He perfectly understood that the heads of the Great Sword were not simple opponents at all, and the successor was able to capture them with such ease. Yuk is literally going crazy at the thought of his future, especially when someone suggested that it might be someone from the demonic forest. Chief Saka replies that he doesn't think so, as the demonic forest has been watched. and there have been no suspicious actions from their successor. The other man added that the heads of the Great Sword were definitely not simple rivals, but in the demonic forest where there is no normal army, such a risk was pointless. Another bystander said that this situation was even more alarming, as it appeared that there was someone more dangerous than the demonic forest. Chairman Saka said that this is why he gathered the concilium, because he thinks that they should help someone in the search. Those present did not entirely agree with this opinion, as they considered this problem to be the concern of the Great Sword alone. Suddenly, one of the guards who guarded the tavern burst into the council. Head Saka asked the man what happened. The security guard told someone that he needed to go to a safe place immediately because an unknown thief broke in and destroyed all the security. Suk Kim Jong was very surprised at this and asked how many there were. He really didn't like dating bad guys. At that moment, En Chu appeared in the meeting hall and said that one should listen carefully to the man who warns of danger. En Chu did not come here alone. Behind him was a young man who kicked him and ordered him to move a little to the side. It was Murup. A hideous smile shone on his face. He burst into the meeting room and said that they had forgotten about the main character. The head of the Muva gang immediately found out and was very worried. He immediately recognized the face of the successor of the demonic forest. The man turned to Yuk and assumed that he was with the demonic forest after all. Muban did not want to admit it. Murup praised Yuk for the work he had done and advised him to press his fifth point against the chair if he wanted to stay alive. The successor ordered his workforce to deal with the two men ahead but not to touch their faces. Engu prepared himself. The leader of the Seven Swords gang, Duen, was not going to wait for his death and took the sword in his hands to teach the uninvited guests in the alliance. But he collapsed for a moment after an unexpected blow from a big man. Engu on the nose, a powerful blow to the face of the enemy. Those present were simply shocked by such power. They looked at their ally with horror on their faces, who started coughing up blood. Ungu acted as if it was his normal day. Poking in his ears, the man invited those present to attack him. The warriors of the Northwestern Alliance were not afraid of this greeting, so they immediately rushed at him in a heap with weapons in their hands. Engu continued to act quite relaxed and silently watched as a bunch of opponents moved towards him. Yuk Muban watched all this with horror on his face. He could not believe that the successor was going to deal with everyone. Murup looked at all this quite calmly. He wanted to get rid of only one person, but probably everything will turn out completely differently. The successor said that it was beneficial for him to keep Master Saka, who was currently attacking Engu, alive because he had a good mind. Yuk Muban proposed to kill Mua's head, as he is very unreliable. Meanwhile, Engu continued his fight. Murup ordered his ward to heal the ugliest, choose the one who looks like a thief engaged in usury. Engu dealt with yet another opponent when the king gave him an order. Now the man could approach him. The ward asked if this monkey would come, pointing at Yuk. Mobin was a little scared and denied that he was the ugliest. Ungu didn't really like the man's reaction. He looked at him with his cold eye with not very good intentions. Yuk Muban continued to shake with fear and waited for a decision from the greeting. He would put a little more in his pants. At this moment, gang leader Mua decided to surprise the enemy by attacking from behind, but Engu saw everything. Having avoided the enemy's primitive attack, the big man looked at the man and replied that he had decided to start with him. Chu Quan Du fell helplessly to the floor after the miss, and was slightly worried after the final words of the unstoppable enemy. In a split second, Ngu landed a powerful blow on the nose of the man who was lying on the floor and dared to attack him from behind. Those present were simply shocked when the big man blew one of the heads of the Northwestern Alliance to pieces. Murup continued to be as restrained as possible, and his assistant Diha was shocked no less than the rest of the Alliance members. Ngu looked powerful and majestic in the eyes of those present. His menacing figure was frightening and made me want to run away from here. After the final blow, Yuk Muban could breathe a sigh of relief, as Ngu chose not to be his first victim. Diho was simply shocked when the big man knocked down the head of the Mua gang with one blow, and did not understand where the Shangshi Ronin had such strength. Murup ordered an assistant to guard the corridor and cut the throat of anyone who dared to enter. Diha began to perform. Murup came to the end of the room and said that after studying the situation he deserved to rest and that he could sit down somewhere nearby. He chose the round window to sit down and addressed the frightened crowd. The successor proposed to start a full-fledged concilium. The successor of the demonic forest decided to stand behind the chief and told those present to take their seats to begin a full-fledged Northwest concilium. The leader of the gang Saka was very angry with the young man and said that he would not be able to get away with this despite his glorious background. The other man added that the young man would not hide behind the Ronin's back, as their gangs were supported by the influential Great Blade himself. Murup laughed back and sharply replied to the interlocutor that he was behaving rather high-handedly for a six of a great sword. The successor looked towards the central door and told his assistant Diha to enter. He figured it out in the corridor with security. Entering the meeting room, Deha was startled by Enhu's strange behavior. Murup ordered his wards to take turns and allowed people to be killed. Meanwhile, the warriors of the Northwest Alliance were approaching the meetings to save the master and yelled at him to beware of the Ronin. At the same moment, Enhu came out of the room and surprised the soldiers. They stopped in their places so as not to be exposed to danger. Zdrovan looked ominously at the singing of potential opponents and told them to make themselves at home. After that, the battle began. Murup turned to Sokka's head and asked if he could hear his charges dying. Mr. Sok was very angry with the successor and asked if he could treat them like that and be as calm as possible. Meanwhile, Deha dealt with another Northwestern Alliance defector by striking him hard in the back. Murup was very surprised by the persistence of his ward and asked what happened to his inner energy. Deha remembered the young man's words that martial arts is survival and used his skills for his own good. Murup was pleased with this conclusion and said that mercy can backfire and should not be allowed to grow. The gang leaders of the Northwest Alliance were angry and wary. They asked the successor of the demonic forest what his purpose was. Murup praised De and told him to deal with the old man opposite as well. Deha immediately obeyed the order. In a split second, the thugs were on the floor and could not do anything about it. Chairman Sokka said that they had had enough. His wards continued to look for him. The chief shouted loudly and ordered the soldiers to move this way. Murup marveled at their devotion, and Chu was about to take on the next batch of warriors. Murup turned to the head again and gave him one last chance to surrender. He said that this would be the best solution for him in this situation since he has almost no chance. The young man added that they couldn't deal with even one Ronin, so their fight would be worthless. The leader of the gang listened carefully to the interlocutor with horror in his eyes. He realized that the young man was indeed right in this situation, and Chu was ready to finish off his opponents at any moment. Murup only needed to say one word to him. Yuk Mobin watched all this action and couldn't believe that he would have to look at men in such a situation. Suddenly, the man's terrible thoughts were interrupted by his successor, who turned his head in his direction and was about to give him an order. The young man said that Yuk could seize the territory of the Muva gang after the death of their leader. Yuk was very grateful to his successor. Murup added that in the new territories it will be necessary to release the stolen women and pay travel expenses. Yuk agreed with everything. Deha appreciated the actions of his new boss, which were bold and unambiguous. He showed no mercy to anyone on the battlefield. Murup showed himself sometimes as the worst thief, but he has rules of survival. Deha was very surprised at such a position. He could say the same about a Ronin named Enchu. He couldn't think of any other Ronin that displayed the same power. Meanwhile, Murup asked the leader of the Coles gang if he liked this schedule of events. Yuk was very pleased with this result. Deha, although he considered the successor to be strange and cruel, but never once regretted that he followed him. The representatives of the Northwestern Alliance decided to surrender and fell to their knees before the successor to spare their people. Murup silently watched the worthless opponents for some time. He was halfway to regaining the power of the demonic forest. The young man ordered De to warn Enchu of the end, as he could finish off everyone on the battlefield without even blinking. Murup told everyone present that today they must break all relations with the Great Sword. The young man asked the men how much money they gave for the Great Sword. Chairman Sokka replied that it was 5% of the profit. The successor understood that something had to be done to win these people over to his side by means of a deficit tax. He answered them that you can forget about training masters and increasing your strength because the Great Sword is just a bunch of bandits. The young man cited himself as an example who does not want to squeeze business from them. He suggested simply paying the Demon Forester 1%. Those present were simply shocked by such an offer. They did not have time to catch the whole course of the young man's thoughts, but they understood what he wanted. Chairman Sokka asked if the young man was indeed wrong about the percentage. Murup replied that he could raise the tax if they wished. 1% sounded like a very attractive offer, but the chairman understood that even such a development was very risky. After hearing the man's thoughts, Murup concluded that Chairman Sokka wanted to refuse his best offer. Those present agreed on 1%, and the young man added that the Northwest Alliance should actively participate in the activities of the demonic forest. Murup said that if the gangs left the Big Sword, then he would definitely have a crisis and he would take care of the persecution himself. Murup suggested that the heads realize their dreams by gradually expanding their holdings rather than paying a 5% tax all their lives. The men asked the successor if he would really give them such an opportunity. Murup shook his head and smiled boldly. The young man said that he could put his head on the line. representatives of the Northwest Alliance arrived at the demonic forest chamber. Here, the general meeting of the demonic forest was taking place, at which the heads of all districts and the supreme head were present. Those present were shocked when the heads of the Northwestern Alliance entered the room and stood right in front of their table. The men could feel the tension in the air. They assumed that the successor had contributed to the cause. The dialogue was initiated by the head of the demonic forest, Cho Mugon. He looked at the guests with a serious look and said that he did not expect to see them here. The guests did not feel very comfortable in such conditions, and for some time they just stood and remained silent. Gang leader Sokka began to speak. He said that he did not intend to appear here himself but thanked the demonic forest for accepting them. Cho Mugon asked the men why they had come here. Sok didn't know how to say it properly and thought for a while. At one point he put his hands together as a sign of respect and said that they wanted to make a truce with the demonic forest. Those present in the meeting chamber were simply shocked by such a proposal. Their emotions could be read on their surprised faces. They could not understand how, after so many years of enmity, the head of the most influential gang himself asks for a truce with them. The head of the demonic forest was shocked no less than his wards. He was literally speechless after such a proposal. One of those present stood up and asked the guests why they were mocking them since they were part of the big ball. This man was very surprised when he heard a familiar voice telling him not to upset the people he had brought. It was Chi Murup who entered the chamber with an assistant and greeted the audience. He was in high spirits. The head of the demonic forest told the successor to sit next to him and immediately explained the situation, which surprised everyone. Murup suggested that it would be better to talk about the benefits that they would be able to get by uniting with the Northwestern Alliance. Chief Sokka remembered the young man persuading them and wanting to give up. However, the successor had already agreed on everything and told the head. Cho Mugon asked his guests if their successor was telling the truth. Chairman Sokka replied that it was absolutely true. Those present could not understand what caused such a decision and how the successor managed to emerge victorious from it again. They mentioned that the leader of the Kulsa gang also came on his own initiative, so it must be some kind of cunning successor tactic. One of the people present was worried more than anyone. He clenched his hands tightly together to release his emotions. It was the head of Urim who couldn't believe his ears. Now he realized that the successor had a very large influence. On the contrary, Narima's head was as relaxed as possible. He periodically scratched his beard and laughed at the situation. He admitted that the successor's tactics were indeed effective, but he still did not understand how he managed to tame these thugs. Murup noticed some doubt in one man's eyes and told Diha that he should know what had happened. The successor saw in the eyes of Chairman Naramu the question of how he managed to achieve all this without making too much noise. Diha felt very anxious at this moment. He did not really understand what his successor wanted from him and did not know how to act. The warrior paused to think over his successor's words and looked in his direction. It seems that he began to understand his boss. In the end, the old man believed that the young man simply persuaded the bandits to join their side thanks to the low payment. The Northeast Alliance has entered into an alliance with the demonic forest. The border of Chongqing underwent major changes. Murup gathered his allies at Chongha's tavern. The talk was that Chongqing was divided into north and south due to the influence of different enemies. Chief Sokka suggested that the Great Sword wouldn't attack right away until he found the gang heads and identified the trespassers. As he sipped his tea, Murup said he thought it would take about 10 days. He asked Yuk if he had dealt with the Mua gang. Yuk replied that everything was completely under control and only one man did not want to worship while the others agreed to cooperate. Then Murup wondered what would happen to Kulsa's gang if their leader died. Yuk was simply shocked by such a question. The successor explained that simply his current wards would want to take revenge for the leader who died recently. Yuk still did not understand why the successor was telling this. His face was like a huge question mark. The man next to him explained that the successor means that the wards should be treated well. Yuk replied that he was not like Chu Kwangdu. Murup moved on to the next question and asked how the Greatsword was doing. Sok replied that they focused their attention on solving the crime. He remembered that the Great Sword had been left by Chongqing for the Ronin. Murup asked why the southern part of the city was empty then. Gang leader Sokka replied that the Great Sword could create the illusion of it as they were unwilling to let go of their territories. He added that among their Ronin there was one great master who was popularly called the Silent Seer. Murup replied that he would protect them from the Great Sword. From today, he decided that the best masters would observe the high. One of those present objected that even though Chongqing was at the top, it would be difficult to know the situation of each gang. Murup replied that it would be enough to simply ask for help. He added that he would leave Enchu in the city. In addition, the young man decided to provide additional security so that his ward could also rest. The man agreed with the successor. Murup ordered the wards to place 3 sentries who, in the event of an emergency, would split up and run for help. If a flare is launched in one place, Enchu immediately comes to the rescue, and the other guard runs to the successor. If the rocket launches in 2 cities, the successor will send an even stronger ward to help. Sok couldn't believe it. He had no idea there was an even stronger Ronin. He thought that if they didn't surrender, the Northeast Alliance would cease to exist. Murup reassured his wards that the big match is still busy with other things, so they have time. One of those present had one more question for the young man about whether the signal rocket would be launched from 5 places at once. Murup replied that in such a case you can run away or hide, and most importantly hold out for about half an hour. The leader of the gang Sokka did not understand where the successor was leading. His face was shocked and he asked about half an hour. Murup put his hand on the table and said that during this time, he would have time to burn the entire great sword and come to save the allies. The successor got up from his seat and said that it was time for him to go home. The Northwestern Union had to tell their wards about the plan. As soon as the successor left the room, the men immediately began to talk about how they would never understand this young man. One of the attendees said that he managed to understand only 2 things from this dialogue. The first was that the demonic forest would definitely not stand aside in the war, and the second was that the successor should definitely not be turned into an enemy. One of the men in front of him did not understand anything and asked himself in his mind what his friends were talking about. Someone suggested that they drink a glass and leave since they still had 10 days left and nothing would happen from a couple of stacks. Chairman Sokka explained that it took 10 days for the Great Sword to be investigated because 5 heads are not so easy to find. The man with long red hair said that it all started at Jianga Tavern and asked Yuk for his opinion on the matter. Suddenly the man realized that the interlocutor was not observed here. He was told that Yuk left immediately after the successor. The leader of the Kulsa gang decided to catch up with the successor as he had one more question for him. He stopped the young man. Murup turned his head back and asked what he needed. Yuk asked if the disappearance of the heads was the work of the successor. Murup only laughed in response to the question and asked if Yuk would now run to report everything to the Great Sword. Yuk replied that he would never do it, especially since they would not believe him. Murup asked why he needed this information then. The man replied that he was now the only one who knew about the true abilities of the successor and he could definitely do it. Murup replied that he did not need to know this at all. Yuk said that he was just curious to know the true power of the successor. The young man raised his hand to his chin and thought. He agreed to reveal his secret only to Chief Yuku. He said that he is not sure about his guesses, but he thinks that there are only 10 people in the world who can beat him. Yuk was simply shocked by this information. He immediately guessed what the successor was saying about the top 10 masters in the world. Murup did not answer anything, surprised at the interlocutor. He just looked at him, waiting for a further reaction. At this moment, the interlocutors laughed loudly. Yuk felt extremely uncomfortable after his own question. Yuk shook his head and told his boss that he'd better go. Murup waved him goodbye and told him to turn. The successor went further forward. He thought about the dialogue that had just taken place and assumed that no one believed him. The young man understood that this was not his true power, as the teacher had put a seal on him that suppressed the yin energy. This technique seals the inner strength until the body grows and achieves a balance between yin and yang. When the seal is removed, Murup will have only 2 equal opponents in this world: the divine dragon Dansoren and the swordsman Chonin. The successor met with his ward and ordered him to cover him until the seal was removed. It was the head of Jinwin's secret squad. He informed that the successor's previous task was completed without witnesses. Murup asked where Jin Huan kept the prisoners. The man replied that it was a prison in a dense forest where it was difficult to get to. Murup ordered his wards to release the men one at a time after 10 days. Jin Huan asked if there would be another task. The young man replied that he would not. He just needed to wait for the moment when his powers reached their maximum. Jin Huan suddenly remembered that the commander had sent a letter to the successor. Murup immediately understood what Manhwa had written to him. He was the same little boy that Murup had saved years before. He grew up to become the commander of the Sichuan army. He was also responsible for external relations on behalf of Qin Murup. Thanks to the skills of Commander Manhwa, Sichuan was able to confirm the status of its martial arts, which were recognized. Murup picked up the letter and thought that Manhwa described in it the event when the Great Sword was able to capture Chongqing. Unfolding the letter, the successor was very pleased with his commander. He always appreciated him for his quick thinking. After opening the letter, Murup was somewhat surprised. He was looking straight ahead where Manhwa had written that he didn't know on a piece of paper. These 2 words put the successor in a stupor. He realized that he had placed such hopes on his commander in this task in vain. The young man tilted his head to the side, hoping that Manhwa had at least added something useful to this letter. Realizing that the letter did not contain any useful information, Murap turned to the leader of Jinwin's secret squad. He ordered him to make Manhwa go hungry for at least a day. The commander looked quite calm. Jinhuan said he would pass on the information. While gathering information about the big match, Manhwa was drinking and didn't know what to write. It was deep night outside. The moon was in the form of a new moon and barely illuminated small areas below it. He trained in a red robe at one of the combat ranges in Chongqing. He honed his movements to perfection. It was Udiha who had been training for quite some time. He decided to take a break to rest. The fighter was exhausted after training, but he wasn't going to stop. He increased his strength day by day. Suddenly, the man felt someone's presence behind him and became very alert. It was like the devil in the flesh. Diha immediately decided to act to avoid putting himself in danger and swung his sword to strike the enemy from behind. He struck a powerful sword blow at the enemy, but it missed the target and was blocked with only one hand. Diha was very surprised to see the enemy's face. His surprise knew no bounds at that moment. He saw his successor in front of him, who easily blocked his shot. Murap said it was pretty good. The successor added that he could not even think that Diha trained so hard and wants to say that he is not a born warrior. Diha did not really want to have a dialogue on this topic and asked the successor what he wanted to say by his unexpected appearance. Murap said that the warrior needed to show himself in all his glory and ordered him to defend himself by putting his wooden sword forward. Diha was ready to accept the challenge from the successor. He got into a fighting stance and said that he was fully prepared for this fight. When the successor swung his sword, Diha felt the demonic energy and was very frightened. He did not expect this. The warrior managed to block the powerful blow of the successor, and he caught himself thinking that for a moment he had forgotten who his opponent was. He understood that the successor was quite strong but completely victorious. Diha used a technique called sword rage. He attacked his enemy with the thought that he was now fighting the youngest ruler of the demonic forest. Murap easily dodged the enemy's attack with one move. The successor could be described in only one word: talent. Diha continued to advance on the enemy, testing the martial arts skills of the successor. The battle continued to rage. Murap forced his opponent to retreat in order not to be defeated in a fraction of a second. Diha appreciated the pure-blood demon's skills. Now he understood why the Great Sword did not want to enter into an alliance with the demonic forest. Diha understood that the successor's skills had been developed over a long period of time and were not at the same level as the Great Sword followers. The warrior was not going to stop in his attack and went behind the enemy, intending to attack him from there. Murap was a little surprised at this turn of events, but he saw everything perfectly and stood still, assessing the danger. Seeing the enemy in the air behind him, Murap turned to him and said that he knew he would do that. Diha was not stopped by the enemy's words, and he finished his attack, but the enemy proved his foresight in this attack. Diha considered his opponent crazy and understood that it was not serious, but it was as if he wanted to kill him. Murap noticed that Diha clenched his sword tightly in his hand and advised him not to be afraid to use more force in this fight. Diha continued to attack the enemy, saying that he had almost overcome him and that fact should not be ignored. Murap behaved very discreetly on the battlefield. He said that it is necessary to take seriously the fact that each master has his own special techniques and strength of spirit. And if Diha can't understand and deal with it, then he will be without a head sooner than he will use his skills. Having blocked the enemy's last attack, Murap dragged him behind him, and this greatly surprised Diha. Putting the sword to the enemy's face, Murap said that it is precisely this rhythm of battle that can distinguish an ordinary fighter from a master. Diha literally could not understand what had happened, and he had already lost the battle. The successor fully confirmed his words. Diha could not do anything and felt as if he had been circled around his finger. He wondered if there was such a big difference in strength between them. All of the warrior's attacks were nullified by just one. Diha realized that the successor was deliberately keeping a close distance. Having lost the battle, the warrior told his successor that his skills were said to be completely different, but everything turned out to be completely wrong. Throwing the weapon out of his hands, Murap suggested that the rumors might be because he learned to fight from his mother. Diha asked the successor who he really was. Murap replied that he himself could not know this and included himself in the top 10 masters of the world. Diha slightly misunderstood his boss. He did not take his words seriously enough, as Murap usually behaved like that. After that, the interlocutors laughed merrily, looking at each other. Diha now realized that the successor was really mad. Murap praised his opponent for the match. Diha got up from the ground and said that he had not shown himself at full strength. Murap told his ward to be more modest. Diha looked at the successor and couldn't believe that he was really that strong. Looking at his weapon, Diha realized that Murup was not a perfect swordsman and his abilities were limited to the feeling of combat. Murup said that he couldn't use all his skills right now, so he didn't need to go to hell. Diha inquired about this. Murup did not really want to answer this question, especially since one urgent idea came into his head. He remembered the dialogue at the meeting when Chairman Sokka informed him that the great sword had been left by Chongqing to the Ronin. Murup said that now everything was clear to him, thereby putting Dek in a stupor. The warrior could not understand anything. The successor told his ward to take the sword and go get it for inspection. Diha immediately went after the boss. The allies set off and Diha kept asking where they were going. Murup still did not want to answer this question. In their direction, people looked at the will of the boss. Murup said that Diha would see everything himself. The warrior replied that he did not understand why they had come here. The allies came to the area of the city that was under the control of the Great Sword. It was the southern part of Chongqing. Diha informed his successor that the people here are completely different and will not fall on his knees. Murup came here for another. Diha explained that what he meant was that the Great Sword would not become ceremonial when it saw that the successor of the demonic forest had arrived here. Murup said that he would protect both himself and his ward. Diha immediately noticed that everyone was looking very askew in their direction. The warrior could not understand what his successor's intentions were. He noticed already many people watching him. Diha informed his boss, however, that spies were secretly watching them and there were a lot of them in the area. Suddenly Murup began to shout loudly, calling the warriors to a duel. Diha was simply shocked by this behavior of the successor. Murup told his potential opponents not to hide but to go to battle with anyone who dared to break into their possessions. Diha tried to stop his boss, but Murup said that everything was fine and noticed that one of the spies was already leaving. Turning his head to the left, the young man noticed two more soldiers who decided to meet the uninvited guests. Murup did not stop counting his potential opponents and already reached the number 9. The Great Sword was not going to show off. The successor continued to glue the fool and pointed his fingers at the men counting their number. Diha was somewhat wary. When the demonic forest warriors were surrounded by all the Ronin present, their number reached 30. The successor was trapped. Murup looked at his ward as if expecting a reaction from him. Diha still did not understand what was happening. Murup said that quite a lot of enemies had gathered. Diha was simply shocked by these words and did not know how to react. Suddenly Murup turned to the robbers and asked who among them was the most important and he needed to see him. Murup did not have to wait long for an answer. He heard a shout and immediately directed his gaze in the direction of that voice. He saw a man sitting on the roof in front of him. He introduced himself as the Chongqing Ronin leader named Mug Yingpi. Murup was pleased that everything was happening very quickly. He told the man that he had come here to see him. Mug Yingpi was smoking a pipe on the roof and did not understand what the successor of the demonic forest wanted from him. Murup reached into his inner pocket and took out a piece of paper. He added that he needed all the Ronin here. After that, Murup threw a piece of paper in the direction of the main Ronin and said that he had an urgent desire to hire them all. Mug Yingpi caught the message from the successor and asked him if he sometimes hit his head somewhere along the way. Murup replied that he was completely sane. Mug Yingpi asked if the successor was aware of who was behind them. Murup replied that he understood perfectly well, but there was no connection with the Great Sword. Diha felt very uncomfortable. Mug Yingpi replied that he didn't care at all if the successor was related to the Great Sword and unfolded the letter to read. Murup rose into the air and decided to sit on one of the roofs. He said that his assignment was to kill. Landing on the opposite roof, the successor said that he would give the task 30 minutes and would pay money for its completion. The young man gave 30 minutes to kill De and take the money. The warrior in red was simply shocked by this turn of events. Murup looked at his ward with a sinister smile. He warned him that this was their last money. Diha was ordered to survive and not lose. The warrior still couldn't believe what his successor had gotten him into. Diha asked the successor why he brought him to the enemy and makes him survive because he knows about the history of his sword. Murup replied that this is the point. There are no friends here to hurt, so Diha can swing her sword as much as she wants. Murup on the charge due to the fact of loss of money. Diha understood that if they lost the money, he would surely die. Mug Yingpi interrupted the dialogue and said that he received a huge amount from his successor, which left him with no other choice. The head Ronin ordered his wards to surround the enemy and break up the camp of the 4 ghosts. Diha prepared to defend himself. Murup was very surprised to hear the head Ronin's words. He could not imagine that the opponents possessed the laws of the camp. Due to the individualism of the Ronin, there are not many warriors with real skills among them. Meeting a real master is a great luck. Chief Sokka said that Mug Inpi is most similar to the legendary Dark Teacher and is the most dangerous opponent. Murup remembered these words and looked at Mug Inpi. He perfectly understood that his ward might not win this fight. Diha stood surrounded by several Ronin and prepared to engage in battle. He decided to imagine that he was on the edge of a cliff. The warrior had to look in all directions at once so as not to miss the moment when the enemy would start to advance. Diha managed to see how one of the opponents decided to start a battle and rose into the air to deliver the first blow. After him, other Ronin also followed whose target was Diha. The warrior stood immovably in place and held on to his sword. The man closed his eyes and realized that his sword could fail, so he concluded that his end would come now. He considered himself a fool who trusted his successor. The sharp axe was already at a distance of 1 centimeter from the head. Suddenly Diha's sword began to move on its own and flashed back the enemy's attack. The enemy was simply shocked by this, but Diha himself was most shocked. His surprise knew no bounds, and he stood on the battlefield with his mouth wide open. The warrior in red looked at his sharp sword, which refused to obey him before, but now it did not let him down. The Ronin continued to attack their opponent, who was now confident in his strength, although he could not have predicted it. After wounding his comrades, Diha thought that he would not be able to fight and win like before. Murup looked at Dek with a satisfied face, who finally realized that he could continue to build a career as a warrior. Mug Yingpi watched this with a less than satisfied face. He figured it would be a slightly easier task for his Ronin, but Diha paired with his sword broke the plans of the main Ronin. The warrior still did not realize that the sword had manifested itself. Murup continued to watch the battle of his ward and understood that the problem was not in him but in the ability to use his sword. Mug Inpi decided to help his wards and ordered them to concentrate surrounding the enemy from all sides. Suddenly the successor addressed the Ronin. Mug Inpi replied that blood had been spilled on the battlefield and there was no point in praying for mercy. Murup expected such a sharp dialogue from the interlocutor. He looked in his direction coldly and said that this was it. Mug Yingpi asked what he meant by that. Murup informed the Ronin that he was also risking his life today. The successor smiled sinisterly and said that Mug Yingpi would also die today and asked if he had anything to say. The head Ronin just smiled back at his successor. But in his mind he was very much alarmed by the young man's ominous smile. Diha continued his battle. Murup believed that this man would never be able to cooperate with his sword again. But everything turned out to be completely different. Murup recognized in his ward's movements a technique called the Red Wind Demonic Sword. It was a special technique, and the successor assumed that it was thanks to it that Diha was able to rise to such a high position. The warrior in red continued to crush the enemies in his path with his sword. He showed his true fury. Murup continued to watch everything with a smile on his face. He marveled at the virtuoso movements of the swordsman. Diha blocked the opponent's blow. The successor noticed that the match becomes quite difficult when you defend yourself with it. The warrior launched a powerful attack and Murup realized that the sword becomes very light and fast when you attack and dodge. The successor praised his protege and called him amazing but warned him to look around. Immediately after these words, Diha decided to turn his head back so as not to expose himself to mortal danger. Murup turned out to be right and Diha narrowly avoided a sharp spear that could have ended his life right now. The man told the soldiers to retreat and rewind their wounds while he himself would deal with the enemy and win their money. The enemy said that Diha was a great sword all this time. Diha asked what his opponent meant. What Ronin meant was that Diha didn't know how to fight the enemy. The warrior replied that he could not use the sword perfectly. Turning to face the enemy, the Ronin said that he needed to pay for the treatment of his wards, so he would definitely win. Murup was very surprised that the man appeared in person on the battlefield and told Diha to keep the money for him. Diha was no longer angry with his boss. He smiled in his direction and said that his part was among the money. At this moment, Mug Yingpi got up from his seat with lightning speed that Diha didn't even have time to notice. In a split second, the Ronin was in front of his opponent and delivered a powerful blow, but Diha managed to block it. Mug Yingpi was very surprised by this block as he felt how heavy the sword was in his opponent's hands. The Ronin stepped back a bit to launch his next attack. He swung his spear to deal damage to the enemy. After assessing the situation on the battlefield, Diha realized that he did not need to block the next attack but rather find an opportunity to use the sword. He delivered a powerful blow to the nose with his quick and light sword, but the enemy was ready for it and avoided the collision. In an instant, the Ronin was behind the enemy. Diha felt his presence there and was very surprised. Mug Yingpi swung his sharp spear with all his might from behind and shouted loudly that the warrior would no longer live. However, Diha had his own plans on this account. He was able to avoid a powerful energy blow at the last moment. Ronin thought that the enemy would no longer be able to evade this. But everything turned out to be a little more complicated and it was necessary to adjust. Diha was not going to lose this fight and was quite serious, although he understood the difference in strength. The Ronin threw several precise and powerful blows at his opponent, trying to cut his head off, but they were blocked. Mug Inpi also found time to kiss. He said that he could not believe that the demonic forest was hiding such a master. Diha swung his sword with all his might and said that the real reason for all this was freedom from the great sword. He launched a powerful blow in front of him that was meant to hit the enemy, but the Ronin stepped back to avoid the collision. Mug Yingpi's wards watched this battle with great interest. They could not even think that anyone could oppose their boss. Mug Yingpi was also unprepared for a long-term battle. He looked at his opponent and thought about how to defeat him. Ronin decided that he needed to use a secret technique as the enemy would become harder to kill as time went on. Mug Yingpi unfurled his spear in his right hand, emitting a colossal amount of energy. He was going to use the Moon Tiger appearance technique. Murup continued to watch this fight with great pleasure. He could not have thought that he would get to the secret technique. Diha also understood that it was a secret technique and did not understand the only thing why the enemy would use it in such a crowded place. Mug Yingpi changed the direction of the wind, and this greatly alarmed the warrior in red. He realized that it was a Ronin fighting technique. Swinging his spear at the enemy, Mug Inpi apologized to him for killing him with this technique. At this moment, Murup shouted loudly in order to stop the fight. Mug Yingpi was forced to stop his attack. He was very angry with the successor and asked why he stopped the fight. Murup calmly replied that time had passed. The successor looked at the Ronin with a demonic look and said that Diha had survived, so the money would have to be returned. Mug Yingpi was simply shocked. Murup continued to press him and added that a person of such high morals is obliged to return the money. The head Ronin was very angry with the successor. He clenched his teeth as hard as he could, trying to control his emotions. He threw the paper with the money back to his successor and ordered his wards to get out of his sight immediately. Murup jumped off the roof and told Mug Inpi not to worry too much. Diha tried to catch his breath after the fight. Ronin ordered his charges to return to their seats. They needed to continue their night patrol in southern Chongqing. Mug Yingpi asked one of his charges to give him drinks. The warrior told his boss that he did a good job. While uncorking the bottle, Mug Yingpi said that 30 minutes had passed too quickly. The ward tried to tell him something. He reported that more than an hour had actually passed on the battlefield. Ronin was simply shocked by such information. He remembered his successor's demonic face and assumed that he didn't stop the fight because he wanted to see his secret technique. Murup from De headed back to their tavern. The successor praised his ward for the work done today. Diha himself was shocked that his mother would behave like this. But everything happened in the best way in the absence of friends nearby. The successor asked if Diha agreed to return to the demonic forest now. The warrior replied that he might not be against it. Diha remembered the last fight with Mug Inpi and said that if Murup had not stopped him, the warrior would probably be dead by now. The successor asked his protege if he could beat him next time. Diha had an advantage as he knew his secret technique. Suddenly, the warrior realized the seriousness of the intentions for the successor. He didn't want to believe that he would actually order it. Murup understood what his ward was saying and smilingly replied that he correctly understood his hints. The successor of the demonic forest said that he was leaving that Ronin in Diha. The warrior was simply shocked by this turn of events. Udeho saw his boss off, thinking that he had stopped giving him orders after Mug Yingpi revealed his secret technique. Murup looked like a great executioner in the eyes of his wards. They were interested in how far he predicted everything. The central regiment had already been formed in the demonic forest army. 2 of his soldiers were going to the palace. Suddenly they stopped when they saw their successor in front of them. One of the soldiers couldn't believe that it was really the same man. In a fraction of a second, they were sure that it was the same successor who freed the Northwest, and next to him was the commander of the Black Sword. The fighters looked at their higher command with respect. The successor drew attention to the strange behavior of his wards. The fighters bowed before the successor and he thanked them. The young man went further forward with his ward. Diha, when he first followed the successor, was not sure that he would be able to return to military affairs. But now he noticed that the coldness in people's eyes was replaced by respect. But it was respect not for them but for their achievements. Murup turned to his ward and said that today the air is quite clean. Diha agreed with these views. The successor did not mean this at all. He drew attention to the soldiers who showed a return of fighting spirit. The warriors were training and already began to realize that very soon the demonic forest would be able to regain its former strength. The successor said that you can't relax under any circumstances. He ordered the assistant to go to the tavern. Murup himself had more important things to do and reached the main chamber. He was going to meet the head and then return to the tavern. The successor climbed the stairs and found himself on the second floor. It was quiet all around, as if in a dark, dense forest. The young man headed further into the head's room. He kept looking around as he was alarmed by the silence. Suddenly, he was addressed by a loud and confident man who greeted the head of the Northwest Department. It was the head of the demonic forest, Cho Mugon, who satirically greeted his nephew. He was looking in his direction, flipping through the book. Murup laughed in response to this greeting and said that he also greeted the high noble lord of the demonic forest. Cho Mugon noted the high spirits of both of them and said that he was ready to help the successor in any of his endeavors. Murup was not against help and told the truth that he lacked people. One man was needed who understands finances. The successor said that the bosses of the Northwest will not joke with money, but he will be more confident to have his ward. Mughan admitted that the next one is right, and then it will be possible not to worry about paying taxes. The chairman said he would send a man. Murup thanked the head of the demonic forest for his help and understanding. He called him uncle for the first time in a long time. Cho Mugon replied to the best man that it was the least he could do. The man looked at his nephew intently. Murup informed the heads of the demonic forest, however, that after the northwestern lands, his target would be the Greatsword clan. Mughan said he knew about it and the Central Regiment had already started its training. Murup asked to ask something. The successor of the demonic forest asked his head what future he wanted for his clan even after several years. Cho Mugon had to think about this question for a while. He took several tens of seconds to think. The head of the demonic forest replied that he wanted every warrior to be able to live in his clan's territory with his head held high. Murup listened attentively to his uncle and looked him straight in the eyes. On the face of the successor you could read some wariness. The head of the demonic forest looked back at his nephew and did not understand why he suddenly became interested in this question. The successor replied that he wanted to fulfill this wish for the head. He said it very confidently and it rang true. Now the chairman has already said that he has one question for the successor. Murup turned his face and said that he was listening carefully. Cho Mugon told his nephew that he wanted to get to know him better. Murup was very shocked by this turn of events. The chief said that they were facing a war with the clans of the Northwest and the Great Sword, and no one could have thought of that until today. The man said that he did not get to interact with his nephew because of work, but he still felt that he was different from the rest. He said that his wish as the head of the demonic forest was for the wards to live with their heads held high. But he had one more wish like an uncle. He wanted to destroy Poma's emotional wall that was hiding behind his nephew's smile. Cho Mugon understood that too much time had passed, but he still asked the young man to tell him about his past. Murup did not expect that the head of the Dominion Forest was transferred personal belongings. His gaze was blank and emotionless. The smile on the young man's face suddenly disappeared, which indicated that he was not entirely willing to share his past and answer questions. Murup smiled and told the leader that the Great Sword could start acting at any moment and he would be sure to contact him. The successor asked His Honor to bow and leave. The chairman understood that the young man did not want to answer the question and asked him to wait. He turned to his black-haired nephew and told him that he had been more than just a thief before. The chairman added that it does not matter to him how Murup lived before and what weight rests on his shoulders after that. It was important to him that his nephew felt at home in the demonic forest as Murup was part of his family. Hearing these warm words from his uncle, Murup stopped in his tracks. After thinking for a while, the young man simply said that it would be better to go. Cho Mugon was satisfied with today's dialogue with his nephew. At least the young man listened to him to the end. Murup left the main chamber in the demon forest and went down the stairs with an inexplicable depression in his soul. He held his heart and did not understand why it started to hurt again. He still felt some strange feelings in this place. Murup had to live without parents under the care of a teacher. He was very grateful to the old man for everything he taught him, but the successor thought that if his parents were alive, they would now be looking at him with the same eyes as his uncle. The young man hit himself on the head and told himself to come to his senses. The successor of the ancient forest believed that feelings clouded the mind. Murup had to choose between his mother's wish or his teacher's, while between the demonic forest or Sanshin. He still leaned towards the second. Murup explained this to himself by the fact that the demonic forest was at least somehow kept afloat, but Sanshin wouldn't last at all without it. The young man pushed aside all feelings and thought only of his mission. His uncle's dream was really not easy. Murup liked to think logically. In order to take over Chongqing, it was enough for him to get rid of the Great Sword Clan. And in order to get all of Sichuan, he needed to bring all the clans to his feet, which was already much more difficult. Uncle wanted to see a demonic forest in which everyone proudly raises their head, and here it was necessary to become strong in order to dispel the doubts of danger. According to Murup, this is the decisive factor in the moral condition of the population. He wanted to make the demonic forest the strongest clan in Murima. The young man was heading forward and perfectly understood that because of the great sword, he would not be able to leave this land for a long time, but his mother's dream must be fulfilled. Suddenly, the successor's innermost thoughts were interrupted by a voice that asked why he had been absent for so long. Murup informed his assistant that the conversation with the head had dragged on and asked what the matter was. Diha replied that they had guests. Murup said that the guests are quite good and asked to be escorted to them. Deh waved his hand and said that these were slightly different guests. He added that these are very important people from the Great Sword. Murup was not very surprised by this and asked who it could be, not the head. Diha replied that it was certainly not a head but very close. It was the Great Sword's successor who was grinning mischievously. Chong Wagi, the demigod sword successor to the Great Sword and one of the 5 geniuses of Sichuan, arrived at the tavern with the head of the Ronin. Murup said he was expecting a successor to arrive and asked if he had arrived himself. Diha replied that he was accompanied by Mug Inpi. The successor laughed at the fact that the Ronin was definitely happy to see Deh. The warrior answered his physiognomy speaks for itself. After exchanging a few words, the representatives of the demonic forest went to their tavern where guests from the Great Sword were waiting for them. John Wagi immediately greeted his vis-a-vis with a smile on his face and said that he is as good as they say he is. Murup did not say a word but simply smiled back at the young man. His face was completely emotionless. The successor of the demonic forest approached the table and met the head of the Ronin in Chongqing on the way. The young man smiled sinisterly in his face and said that he would also like to say hello to the successor of the Dominion Forest. Mug Yingpi confidently replied that he thought they were not in the right relationship to exchange pleasantries. Murup gave him an even more sinister look and called him a bore. According to the young man, this was not a very good relationship. The successors of the warring clans sat down at the same table. Behind the backs of both young men stood their first deputies and guarded them. Murup looked at his potential interlocutor or enemy and remained silent for now. His gaze was serious and blank. John Wagi also didn't want to start the dialogue first, and there was absolute silence at the table. After all, he was visiting. At some point, Murup offered his guests to eat and added that he could not be afraid that he would not be divorced for money. Wagi refused the food and smiled back. He thanked for the offer and said that he would rather drink tea. Murup turned his head towards the kitchen and ordered his cook Adana to assure them of tea if it was available. The demonic forest successor thanked his visage for coming. Kwagi asked the interlocutor why he did not appear first. Looking at Mug Yingpi, Murup said that the people in the Great Sword looked at him with some contempt and a desire to kill. Kwagi apologized for this and said to be warned next time. Meanwhile, tea was brought to the interlocutors and Murup agreed to stop by next time. Mug Yingpi carefully watched and listened to everything the young men talked about, including good alcohol at the meeting. He was somewhat surprised. Murup was also not very happy with the situation around him. He didn't like the company of the 2 big sword idiots. At some point, the successor smiled and told his charges to leave them alone. The men immediately left the tavern. Wagi immediately understood that the visitor wanted to speak alone and ordered Yingpi to go out immediately and wait for him outside. The successors of the 2 warring clans were left alone at one table. Now they could talk face to face. Kwagi immediately asked the interlocutor how his successor would be after a bad past. Murup replied that it was nothing special. While sipping tea, Wagi said that there are many people who remember the supremacy of the demonic forest and treat the successor with respect. Murup remembered his first reception in the meeting chamber and the angry looks in his direction. But on his word, he decided to play along with the interlocutor. Wagi asked what the successor was going to do. Murup immediately replied that his goal was to get rid of the Great Sword. The demonic forest successor asked the visage if he was overestimating his clan. Wagi replied that the demonic forest would not lose its supremacy. Murup bowed his head on his hand and said that all this happened because people had memories of the past. He explained that some were and still are the opinions of people around. They do not want to take risks and are afraid of judgment from others. The young man added that they do not want to contradict their pride and live in conditions of insignificant reality and human sacrifices. Murup folded his hands together at the table and ended his speech by saying that he is completely different from all these people. There are no memories of the bright past left in the young man's memory. No one told him about it in his childhood, so nothing stops him. Kwagi listened attentively to his interlocutor, who told someone that he was ready to even lick the enemy's shoes or kill an ally. The successor of the Great Sword laughed after finishing the speech and said that this approach of survival in the Murima is close to him. Wagi added that Murim is a very difficult place to survive and he fully supports all the thoughts of his vis-a-vis. Murup replied that he was glad that they thought alike. At the end of the conversation, the young man offered to ask each other one last question. Wagi agreed to this and asked who would start first. As the host, Murup offered the guest to start first. The successor of the Great Sword thanked him for this and began to think about what interesting things to ask in the face. After thinking for a while, Wagi looked at his interlocutor with a serious and angry look and asked if he really did all this. Murup immediately understood what the young man was talking about. He asked if he meant his personal or the entire demonic forest. Kvagi pointed a finger at the interlocutor and added that he usually means the successor personally. Murup noted the intelligence of the interlocutor. Wagi said that everything happened somehow suddenly. After the disappearance of the heads of the branches, the leaders of the Northwest also turned away from the Great Sword. Murup, with a smile on his face, told the interlocutor not to worry as the hostages would be released from tomorrow. Kvagi thanked for such a service and said that the relatives are very worried about them. Murup replied that there is no need to make a non-human out of him. Wagi said that he does not blame the successor for anything because this is how their world is arranged, and if a person is alive then it is already good. When he finished answering the questions, the successor of the Great Sword said that it was his turn to ask about his visa. Murup asked how many days Wagi thought it would take him to destroy the Great Sword. Kvagi asked what kind of question it was. He thought that Visavi would ask something more important, but he replied that he thought that even 3 years would not be enough for such a demonic forest. Kvagi asked the interlocutor for his opinion. Murup put all his fingers forward and answered that he would need 10 days. In his opinion, this term was real enough to completely destroy the Great Sword. Wagi disagreed with this. He finished his tea and set the cup on the table. Kvagi noted his interlocutor's sense of humor and laughed at the joke. Wagi replied that since the heads of the branches were still alive, he was giving the enemy an opportunity to prepare until they returned. The Grand Sword's successor added that it would take place over the course of 6 days. Murup asked why he would not give him 10 days. Kvagi did not want to make concessions and said that when they meet next time they will say goodbye in a less friendly way. Murup looked askance at his vis-a-vis and asked if their next meeting would be more interesting than the current one. Approaching the door, Kvagi turned to the interlocutor and assured him that he would make the next meeting unforgettable. Mug Yingpi was waiting for his boss outside the door, and after leaving he immediately asked how everything went. Wagi replied that the Ronin was right about the successor. Murup seemed like an ordinary fool at first, but in reality he turned out not to be like that at all. Kvagi believed that there was no need to lose vigilance with such an enemy. The successor said that they needed to act while the missing comrades returned. Mug Yingpi asked if the boss really wanted to postpone the disappearance case. Kvagi replied that he was really sorry for the relatives of the missing, but the problem needed to be solved right now. The successor understood that if he did not wait, some might not return, but on the other hand, there are those who could take the place of the heads. He ordered the Ronin to begin training immediately. Kvagi did not want to give in to such a strong opponent. In addition, the young man was not going to wait 6 whole days. He considered it necessary to deal with the successor of the demonic forest in 2 days. Diha also returned to his boss and asked how everything went. Murup replied that Wagi did not give him 10 days but only 6. Diha said he wanted to hear something a little different. Murup turned back displeased and asked what his warrior wanted then. Diha said that the master of the master could see from afar, hinting at whether the successor was able to assess the strength of the opponent. Murup began to think demonstratively and said that you cannot outrun such an enemy on one goat. Diha did not agree with this. Putting his hand on the shoulder of the ward, the successor said that he was right and it would be much more difficult to get around him. Murup was going to visit the central regiment and told his son to get ready. Diha asked what exactly. The successor of the demonic forest did not give a clear answer to his ward. He confidently headed forward with a good feeling. He remembered the face of a potential opponent and did not want to wait 6 whole days for their next meeting. His sinister smile reflected his intentions. Murup said that he was going to do away with the Great Sword in the next day. Murup was on his way to rest through the night city. There wasn't a single person around, only one successor of the demonic forest. The young man confidently stepped forward and periodically closed his eyes to listen to extraneous sounds that constantly alerted him. Suddenly, Murup still heard something. The successor assumed that these could be Great Sword spies as usual. Murup clearly felt their presence near him. He supposed that there were still 3 of them not far from him. The successor ordered his assistant to ignore the spies, but after the capture of the northwestern lands, they became even more intolerable. Murup perfectly understood that nothing can be solved here by brute force. If he kills these team spies, the next ones will come after them. The successor went to the ward and was greeted by one of the wards. He said that he had gathered everyone whom Murup asked. The young man entered the meeting room and immediately apologized for the delay. He thanked those present for agreeing to gather at night. Among those present were all the faction heads of the demonic forest. As always, they were waiting for what the successor planned. The head of the demonic forest reported that the central regiment's command was in place and asked the successor why he had gathered them. Murup looked at his uncle with a sinister and cold look. He said that it was necessary to strike the great sword. Cho Mugon expected anything from his nephew, so he wasn't even surprised and just bowed his head in thought. The rest of those present were completely shocked by such a decision. They looked at the successor as if he were some kind of madman. One man decided that not everyone was at home with the young man, but Naram's head stopped him just in time to speak. He inquired about the young man's plan. The old man said that it was necessary to hurry with the preparations, to which the successor replied that there was no time for that, and it was necessary to attack now. 2 more heads of the faction were shocked no less by their faces. They believed that at least some plan should be thought out first. Murup reported that the successor of the Great Sword came to him today, so the enemy is also aware of the events and is starting preparations. The young man told that he would release 1 hostage every day, and they have 6 days. He did not manage to win more time. Those present were simply shocked by such logic. They did not want to believe that they would have to put their reputation at risk. The head of the demonic forest asked everyone present to calm down. He asked the successor what he was up to. Murup said that the Great Sword is a pretty big clan, but that's only if they have branches. There are a total of 500 people in the Great Sword branch. The successor assumed that half of them went to investigate the disappearance of the heads. Murup wanted to get rid of the spies and cut the information thread. Chairman Naramu believed that it would be better to launch a massive attack on the main military object. Cho Mugon intervened in the dialogue and said that if the battle drags on, then the Great Sword forces will group together and they will find themselves in a hopeless situation. Chief Weramu also decided to intervene and announced that if they gathered all their forces to attack, they themselves would be defenseless. Murup offered to take all the families with him, and then there would be no point in attacking an absolutely deserted place. It was about a centralized regiment. After the successor's last words, those present had no choice but to agree with him. It was deep night outside. The Great Sword clan's central military building continued even at night. The successor of the Great Sword was on his way to his home, who was constantly thinking about only one thing. It was 6 days given to the demonic forest. The young man was absolutely sure that his and Chin Murup's thoughts coincided, and he could not believe that exactly 6 days would pass. Kvagi began to climb the stairs. He made a promise to his visage just to dust his brains a little. Entering the room, the young man greeted the man in front of him and informed him that he had returned. This man polished his sword at night and waited for his successor to return. He was informed about the latest events. It was the head of a great sword named John Byung. He said that he knew that the successor was meeting with his counterpart from the demonic forest. The successor was surprised at how quickly the news arrived. The Great Sword Chief asked if it was allowed to do so. Kvagi turned to his father and asked to speak. The chief looked at his son through the shining blade of the sword and told him to speak. The successor said that they must go to war with a dangerous enemy and strike first before it is too late. John Byun replied that they had been pressuring the demonic forest with finances for a long time, but all their efforts were in vain. The chairman asked his son who came up with the plan for the financial issue. Wagi replied that it was Chief Pansayan. After receiving an answer from his son, the head called his ward named Yukon. Jung Byun immediately got a call back. The chief ordered his ward to immediately transfer the head of this chief to him. The ward had no other choice. The successor told his father that he did not have enough mercy. The leader replied that mercy brings only defeat. Jung Byun decided that he had no choice but to start a war with the demonic forest. He asked his son if he had a plan. Kvagi replied that of course he had it. The young man began to emotionally tell his plan to the smallest detail. The conversation with my father dragged on until late at night. The interlocutors continued to sit across from each other at the table all the time. The Great Sword Chief listened carefully to his son and pondered whether his plan would really be suitable. The candle on the table was almost burnt out and there was nothing left of it. Kvagi was already finishing talking about his plan of action. Suddenly someone knocked on the door. The father stopped his son and asked who dared to interrupt them at such a time. The man introduced himself as Tan-El. He was a messenger and brought a letter for the head. Jeon Byung ordered the message to be brought to him. The head of the great sword opened a wide sheet of paper and began to read. The successor immediately asked what was written there. Father replied that the demonic forest was going to leave the central regiment and attack the branch. Their intelligence worked perfectly. Kwagi noted Murup's cleverness. He expected the young man to act first, but he didn't think it would happen so quickly. The successor understood that it was necessary to make adjustments to the plan. The father told his son that he was just as bad at hiding his emotions. The head of the great sword stood up from the table and told his son that if he had already decided to get the weapon, then there should be no doubt. He added that it is necessary to take not only the life but also the soul from the enemy, even if you have to lose an arm yourself. Zhang Bian informed his successor that the enemy could strike from any side and that one should be prepared physically and mentally. Wagi asked his father to stop and wait. The head was in a state of euphoria and was a little angry. He asked his son what he wanted. Wagi could not immediately begin to speak. Something in his throat seemed to stop him. He said that it was necessary to prevent the enemy from striking the defeated soldiers in order to gain a numerical advantage. Wagi said that the meeting with Chin Murup helped him to look at himself in a new way, and he also learned something. The father asked his son what exactly he had learned. Wagi smiled sinisterly after his father asked his opinion. The successor said they had two plans A and B. The young man understood that his father wanted to go according to plan B. The head of the great sword cast his gaze on his son and began to listen carefully. He ordered him to continue his logic. The successor repeated his father's words that it is necessary to take not only the life but also the soul from the enemy. The chairman confirmed it loudly. Wagi threw the paper on the floor and said that when a perfect plan fails, a very strong disappointment sets in. The successor of the great sword led to the fact that it was necessary to change the plan and throw the soldiers of the branch to their own devices. The head was very surprised. Wagi did borrow the demonic ways of war from Europe. He added that even with such losses, they would still have a huge advantage. The demonic forest clan began preparations for the imminent war. Many people were drafted to help the army. A special forces unit called Devil's Flower was assembled in full force. It was headed by a commander named Ka Yakping. The wards were fully prepared and about to set off. Suddenly, the commander's attention was diverted by something behind him. Turning his head, the man saw in front of him the head of the Tezen ward. Cho Painchin arrived at his former charges. Ka Yakping immediately greeted the old man and informed him of the readiness of his squad. The retired chairman said he did not come here to lead. Punchin said that although he retired, no one should sit back. The current chairman asked him to provide protection. One of the wards interrupted the commander-in-chief's dialogue. The herald was looking for Cho Pyeongkon to inform him and finally found him. The messenger landed on the ground and told the master that he had been ordered to follow a secret path into the shelter. The retired chairman immediately understood that the battles on other fronts had already begun. He wished all the fighters good luck in the battles. The head of the special forces was in complete agreement with Cho Pyeongkon. He silently nodded his head in response to the words. Meanwhile, the other allies of the northern forest dealt with the two enemies. They were spies watching the successor. With him was the head of the demonic forest, who said that these bugs had finally paid for their services. Murup said that now their people are safe and it is time to start acting. He behaved as confidently as possible. His confidence was felt by Cho Mugon, who lifted his firm gaze upwards to look at his charges. Among them were all the leaders of the faction who had previously participated in the meetings. They expected what the head would tell them. The heads of Weramu and Naramu also listened attentively to the boss, who said that this moment had indeed come. Mughan gave the order to divide into his squads and leave. They all had to meet at the appointed place. The wards wished success in battle to their leader. They folded their hands as a sign of respect and added that they believed in him. Mughan nodded his head in gratitude to his charges. Now it was possible to start performing dangerous tasks. The head of the demonic forest prepared himself for battle. He turned away from his charges and stood silently for a while. After some time, the chairman gave the order to leave, and they went with Murup and the whole squad to carry out the mission. A rather long journey awaited them before meeting the enemy. Mughan was constantly thinking about his nephew. He constantly looked in his direction and understood that the young man did not waste time on training and was very well prepared physically. No one from the clan had such equipment as the successor. The chairman concluded that he had studied with someone else. At some point, Mugon turned to his successor and said that he could stop. Murup offered to do it just now. The head of the demonic forest was surprised by such a decision from the successor and asked if he was sure about it. Murup replied that he wanted to stop right now and was followed by the chief and their entire squad. The chief asked his nephew what the matter was because he wanted to strike at the enemy. Murup replied that it was only Plan B. Mughan asked the successor why he did not choose Plan A. Murup said that before the meeting 3 spies were hiding near him, but they managed to catch only 2. The chairman immediately understood that his successor thought that all the information had leaked out. Murup continued and said that 3 men were not enough to follow the central regiment, so the enemy mercenaries were also inside. He believed that one of these should have been present at the meeting. Everyone present listened attentively to the guesses of the successor. The chairman denied these assumptions and said that this cannot be as the leadership has faithfully served the clan for more than 10 years. Murup continued to stand his ground and said that the capture of the Northwest seemed to be the starting point of the enemy. The young man understood that if the surveillance was entrusted to only 3, then there was a more proven spy among the others. The head was shocked. Murup remembered his dialogue with the successor of the Great Sword. Then he asked him who was responsible for the disappearance of their superiors. John Wagi understood very well from the very beginning that the demonic forest was of no use here, and it was all the work of the successor himself. Murup knew that only Decca and the head of Coles saw his abilities, but Decca was removed from his position, so his candidacy fell away. The head of Coles was so intimidated by the successor that he would definitely never want to cooperate with the Great Sword again. It seemed illogical to Murup that the successor of the Great Sword immediately thought of someone who had been beaten by a gang of ordinary thugs. The young man said that he told about Plan B at the meeting as he assumed about an internal spy and now he needs to be replaced. The successor said that it is necessary to immediately switch to Plan A in order to protect yourself from unnecessary clashes with the enemy. Murup knew that if they killed only 2 spies, the third immediately ran to relay information to the enemy headquarters. The leader of the Black Soul Squad named Chi Vorin immediately understood that in such a case the enemy would be able to surround them. But Murup denied such a development. Vorin wondered if the enemy would save his people. Murup perfectly understood that the enemy would not want to deviate from his plans. Young Wagi hoped that they would dance to his tune. Looking at the allies, the successor said that he had mentioned an additional plan at the meeting, but even with it, they would still be outnumbered. The chief asked if the young man really meant to say that the enemy would abandon their allies and attack the Northwest. Murup said that it would be so. The head of the demonic forest knew his vis-a-vis and his son who only pursued their own gain so they could do this. Mugan said that they cannot abandon the allies who have joined their side, so it is necessary to go to their aid. The successor of the demonic forest was in complete agreement with his uncle. He said that it was necessary to leave immediately. Meanwhile, a squad called the Devil's Flower was advancing to the northeast. They were still sticking to Plan B. Suddenly their leader stopped in his tracks when he saw an obstacle in front of him in the form of his own allies. He lifted his head up and saw before him the head of Uerima, who had come to deliver the announcement. Yu Hassan loudly ordered the Devil Flower squad leader to turn back immediately as their plan had changed. The man could not understand what they were trying to tell him. It seemed very strange to him that it was necessary to return to the starting point. Wu Hassan reported that the situation in Chongqing had changed and the chairman ordered to return to the central regiment. Chairman Weramu added that all the details can be found out on the spot. The leader had no choice, so he immediately obeyed this order. Yu Hassan carefully observed the emotions of the squad leader. He remembered the successor's words about the spy inside the structure. Before that, Murup informed the head of Narim and Urim that the rat had taken up residence among them. The men did not want to believe it. The successor said that everyone present at the meeting was under attack and told to stop the squads at the place where he ordered. Murup told the men to keep a close eye on the leaders because they definitely have to react somehow to the fact that plans have changed. Hassan was ordered to stop the Devil's Flower squad in the northeast. He constantly looked in the direction of the squad commander. His name was Cho Yanghil, and the head of Urim had high hopes for this man and did not want to believe who he was as a spy. Meanwhile, the other squad was also notified that they had to go back. The reaction was in accordance with the order. The head of Main's department named M. Jiangung was simply shocked by this turn of events. He did not understand why this was necessary. The head of Naramusan Hogan stopped the squad in the said city and announced that the plans had changed suddenly. Jungkook asked what could have changed in the hour since they left. Hogan replied that he himself did not know all the details. The head of the department main reacted ambiguously to this situation. Chairman Naramu informed that they will deal with it on the spot. Chonggong told the higher command that his squad needed to catch their breath and then they would be on their way immediately. The leader turned to face his charges and told them to rest for a while before making a dash in the other direction. Chairman Naramu carefully observed Jianggen's emotions, and they also seemed ambiguous to him. This alarmed the old man a little. Chairman Urim Yu Hassan had complete confidence in Commander Cho Yanghil. He couldn't even think that it could be him. Likewise, Chairman Naramu trusted Chonggun completely. They did not want one of these two to be a spy. It was deep night outside. The full moon brightly illuminated the treetops, casting their shadows on the ground. The head of the department, Meng Chonggong, still could not come to terms with the fact that his squad would have to go back. He was standing in front of a tree trunk and muttering something to himself. The man was extremely dissatisfied and angry. For a second, Jungkook thought that he had imagined something but decided not to check it and was already on his way. It was not for nothing that the commander checked the trunk of a nearby tree. Behind him was a greatsword spy who was listening to everything. He hid his face behind a black mask. Suddenly, the spy noticed something useful and raised his eyes upwards. A note wrapped with a rope hung on a tree branch. The man thought for a while about whether he should take her. In the end, he decided to take it and read it. The spy approached the tree and reached up with his right hand. As soon as the spy's hand approached the note, it was immediately cut off for trying to intercept important information. The commander of the secret squad of the demonic forest named Huang Sol stopped the spy and ordered him to be interrogated. However, the man had other plans for his future life. Clenching his teeth, he said that they couldn't wait for the information to be presented. After that, a small explosion rang out in the forest and smoke went up. Huang Sol realized that the spy had deadly poison in his mouth. The greatsword enemy fell to the ground after the explosion. The spy sacrificed his life for the interests of the clan. The commander bent to the ground to pick up the note. The wards immediately understood that all the guesses about the spy were true. Huang Sol opened the letter and began to read. His face was confused. The wards did not understand anything yet. One of the soldiers turned to the captain and asked him to explain why his facial expression had changed dramatically. Huang replied that their immediate superior turned out to be their traitor, if that didn't sound paradoxical. Chairman Narima called M. Chonggun to him. The head of the department, Moan, immediately landed behind Mr. Chairman Naramu asked if everything was ready. Jianggung replied yes, but his squad had not yet arrived. At that moment, his squad landed behind the leader. Jungkook was a bit wary at this moment. He saw the soldiers in front of him led by Huang Sol, who was displeasedly holding the intercepted letter in his hands. The man's face could say everything for him. He was very angry at his higher rank visa. Huang Sol clutched the letter tightly in his hand. It seemed that if another couple of seconds passed, the paper would peel off. Now the worst guesses of Head Naram have been confirmed. He clutched his head in frustration. Jianggung immediately began to justify himself to the master. Drops of sweat appeared on his face from fear. Huang Sol raised his voice and asked the traitor why he was conducting secret correspondence with the enemy. Department head Meng tried to explain to the commander that it was just a misunderstanding, but it looked false. Chief Narima asked the traitor how long ago he betrayed them. Jungkook blurted out that he was just framed. He began to shake and said that some piece of paper there could not inspire more trust than his 40 years of experience. Jungkook continued to talk nonsense, trying to justify himself. At some point, Narima's head ordered him to shut up. There was no limit to his rage. He did not understand how it was possible to sell the lives of his brothers for his own benefit. M. Chonggong realized that he would not be able to justify himself. He assumed that his life path would end here. The traitor began to laugh hysterically from hopelessness. His former wards decided to take up arms. Chognan said that he was not satisfied with the ship called Demonic Forest. The old man asked, and only because of him became a traitor. Chonggun wanted to become a greatsword hero, but turned out to be an ordinary traitor to his once native demonic forest. Narima's head reached for his sword. Jianggung didn't even think of repenting for being a true traitor. The old man said, bringing the blade of the sword to his face, that according to the rules the traitor would be punished at the scene of the crime. M. Chonggong was not going to contradict his boss. He said he accepts this punishment. There was no way back. In a split second, dark blood spilled in the forest. Chonggun completed his earthly journey under the glow of a full moon. The head of Naram was calm and cold-blooded in relation to the traitor. He hid his sword and said that he needed to find out about Jianggun's family. After that, the allies went to Chongqing. Their short-term shelter was located in the northern forest. All soldiers arrived at the appointed place. It turned out to be a traitor from 2 squads. Chief Naramu killed him personally. Chief Urim ordered everyone to gather so as not to undermine the fighting spirit of the warriors. It was necessary to immediately pull myself together. At this moment, the attention of everyone present was drawn by a voice behind who greeted and bowed his head low. It was Udiha, who had been discharged from the army. He said that he had come here on the orders of the successor of the demonic forest. The head was simply shocked. Murup did not want to believe that these disputes would again become an obstacle to a solid mind. Diha reported that 5 shots were fired recently. The Great Sword was attacking the northwest. Everyone present was shocked when they heard this news. They couldn't believe it was real. The assumption of the successor turned out to be true, and it was not to everyone's liking. Murup had many unfriendly friends. One of the faction heads looked at the young man and couldn't believe that this was the same person who had been kicked by Cole's gang. The head of the demonic forest turned to the successor and said that it wouldn't hurt for them to listen to his plan first. Murup asked the assistant if there was any news from the head of the Great Sword. Diha replied that he was not seen with the squads. The successor thought that if the old man was not seen with the soldiers, then he must be in his palace. The young man suggested that because of the battle in the northeast, the palace might be abandoned, so it should be captured. The head of the demonic forest reiterated that they could not abandon the northwest after they sided with them. Cho Mugon ordered his wards to immediately leave for the capture of the palace in order to have time to help the allies. Diha informed the head that he had found a path that was not guarded by anyone and asked to lead them with him. Murup thought about how his wards were fighting in Chongqing. He wanted them to last at least an hour, and Chu was in the prime of his life. He crushed the enemies on his way regardless of their number. Meanwhile, the Great Sword Clan had set up their hideout in the Unsen department. Their head was hiding here. Jung Byun looked up at the sky. He was talking to someone and said that the sky is very beautiful today. Above the man hung the severed head of his ward. He spoke to the dead head of Chief Unsen. Mug Yingpi was shocked because the head was beheaded for the slightest provocation of one of the sectors. Jung Wagi said it was time for them to get ready. Mug Inpi agreed and announced that all the Ronin were ready. The successor of the Great Sword bowed before his father and promised him to burn the demonic forest to the ground. Wagi was very surprised when his father told him to wait, as their task was to hurry. The young man became very angry when his father said that he could not be trusted. He asked what the chairman meant. John Byun said that his son was too weak to deal with the entire demonic forest. Suddenly Jung Wagi was very scared when he heard strange sounds behind him. Someone broke into them. Immediately shouts began to be heard that the enemy had invaded the Great Sword. It was a demonic forest led by a head. The head of the Great Sword turned to his son and said that he would have cut off his head too if he had not been the successor. A few seconds later, a warrior with his own fighting style burst into the office. He loudly called Chan Wagi's name. The supporters of the demonic forest immediately stood still and waited for what was about to happen. Chin Murup entered the room together with the heads of Narim and Urim. He greeted his vis-a-vis from the enemy clan. Jung Wagi didn't feel as confident as he did the last time they met. He looked very warily at Murup. As many as 800 soldiers from the main forces of the demonic forest had arrived at the Great Sword Clan. They had an advantage over the enemy. Chin Murup smiled pleasantly and said that he was very happy to meet John Wagi himself again. The successor of the Great Sword looked at the opponent and wondered why the successor was here and not at the branch. Murup assumed that Wagi was thinking about when everything went wrong. The rest of the demonic forest were serious. The head of the demonic forest turned to his vis-a-vis and greeted the head John Byun not very warmly. The Great Sword head greeted back. He said that they had not met so pleasantly for a long time. Cho Mugon said that he hadn't received an invitation in a while, so he decided to visit himself to talk for a while. Taking out his sword, Jung Byun said that he would have found it himself if Cho hadn't come. He understood that the enemy surrounded them. Without the Ronin, the Great Sword had about 100 fighters at its disposal. The demonic forest had numerous advantages. The head of the Great Sword was in a very difficult situation. He did not think that this would ever happen in his own house. John Wagi turned to his father and said that he would make a way, and then they would be able to reach the northwest in time. Mug Yingpi felt out of place. He assessed his surroundings and exhaled heavily after that. The Ronin warned the successor that it was best to start the battle before the demonic forest was in full force. John Wagi confidently looked ahead and agreed with the head Ronin. He was preparing to attack. In a couple of seconds, the Great Sword decided not to wait any longer but to attack the enemy. The head was also ready to fight. Cho Mugon also decided not to sit back on the defensive. He turned to his successor and asked him to leave Chong Bayan to him. Chief Weramu did not engage in battle on orders. He assessed the situation on the battlefield, which was in favor of the demonic forest. He was looking at Chong Biyun, who was nicknamed the Sichuan Sacred Sword. Could scare anyone in Murima, but he was opposed by Cho Mugon, a demonic sword of destruction whose fame was no less magnificent. The head of the demonic forest was the first to enter the fray, delivering a powerful blow. The battle of the two giants has begun. Jung Wagi felt out of place. He was waiting for Chin Murup, but the successor of the demonic forest was in no hurry. The red-haired warrior decided to attack first. He gripped his sword tightly and brought the blade to his head. Murup stood opposite and watched this with a stony face. The young man was not going to do anything yet. Wagi continued to demonstrate his skill and was about to use a deadly orange energy technique. Ratpalm, he was stopped by his father and ordered not to use this technique for anything. The successor apologized for this. Wagi could only demonstrate this technique when he could kill all the witnesses. But now was not the right moment. Murup ordered the army to block the greatsword's retreat to prevent them from escaping. The young man saw only the initial stage of Wagi's attack, but he managed to notice everything that was needed. He was very alarmed by this technique. The order was given to surround the great sword. The plan was to skillfully use their numerical advantage. Murup decided to rise into the air and look at everything from a height. He kept thinking about that technique. Lowering his head, the successor saw that his uncle had engaged in battle with the head of the Greatsword clan. They fought not for life but for death. Losing loses everything. Everyone understood this very well during the battle. John Wagi and the Ronin formed a circle. Murup knew they needed to be watched as they could reach Mughan. The successor first of all wanted to deal with Mug Inpi. Suddenly he realized that he was not watching Udiha. Meanwhile, Diha felt like he was in a situation from the past. He held the sword firmly in his hand, but it was shaking. The warrior himself in red stood behind his allies and could not move. He was very afraid of making a mistake. Diha noticed the successor telling him not to be afraid and not to think that he might injure his allies. Diha turned back and remembered that his main target was Mug Inpi, who had been ordered to be eliminated by Murup. Diha immediately came to his senses after the successor's look and told himself that now was not the time to doubt and hide. The man felt a second wind in himself and confidently rushed into battle, saying that Mug Yingpi could dig his own grave. Ronin in turn fought with other warriors. However, he could not fail to notice the attack from the warrior in red. The fighters collided with swords. On the battlefield began another battle of roughly equal opponents. Diha no longer doubted himself and promised the enemy that today he would die at his hands personally. Murup watched as the other Ronin immediately began to panic after Diha stepped on Mug Inpi. The successor of the demonic forest was fighting a tactical battle. He called the heads Uerima and Nerima to him for an order. He told them to take the smaller half of the squad and head northwest. He himself promised to join as soon as he finishes here. Chairman Nerimu was in no hurry to leave. He called the commander of the Black Soul unit to him, who immediately arrived. The old man ordered the commander not to take a single step away from his successor until the battle was over. Now he could leave with peace of mind. Murup only waved his hand at him, saying that he would manage without him. Murup continued to watch the battle between the two heads of the warring clans. He noticed one very strange thing. The young man noticed something wrong in the movements of the head of the greatsword. Something seemed to be missing between the use of techniques. After observing for some time, the successor came to the conclusion that the head seems to be deliberately avoiding the most effective movements. Suddenly, one thought dawned on the young man. His eyes widened in shock. He recognized something wrong in these movements. The demonic forest successor realized that he needed to take some action after what he saw. The commander of the Black Blood unit asked the successor what happened to him. The young man replied that there was work for the man. He tossed him a piece of wood and ordered it to be handed over to the head of Wangma's department immediately. The warrior caught the message. He looked at this mini-message and wondered if he really needed to deliver it himself. The successor confirmed. The commander of the Black Blood unit immediately ran to deliver the message, as he understood that the successor did not give stupid orders. In a minute, the man found himself next to the recipient, who was fighting with opponents, and handed him a message from his successor. The head of the department Wangma wanted to know why he did this. The messenger replied that this was what the successor had ordered. The commander of the Black Blood unit turned back and informed his successor that his message had been successfully delivered. But looking up, the man realized that he was talking to himself. The successor of the demonic forest has disappeared. The heads of the two warring clans continued their battle. Cho Mughan had the upper hand and Zhang Bian was forced to defend. The head of the demonic forest told his visage not to run away anymore, but simply to surrender and save the lives of his wards. But Yung Byung had his own plans for this fight. He quickly assessed the situation on the battlefield and found his son behind him. Retreating to the right distance, the greatsword head took his son by the collar and pulled him with all his might. He placed his successor in front of him as a defense and said that he was not going to surrender. Wagi was not happy. Cho Mugan was shocked that the opponent was using his own son as a defense mechanism on the field. The man had no choice and had to attack. Yung Wagi blocked the blow, thus saving his father. The successor looked at his father, turning his head back, and asked why he was doing this to him. The greatsword head told the successor that it was time to prove that he was worth something. After that, Bayan decided to leave his son to fight with the head of the enemy clan. Cho Mugon ordered the enemy to stop. However, the great sword head was not going to do that. He was leaving the battlefield to save his life. John Byun thought he would be able to injure his opponent, but he was unable to use his technique in front of witnesses. Retreating, the man thought about the fact that everything is not over yet and he needs to quickly reach the allies in the northwest. Suddenly, Byun saw a strange flow of energy in front of him and immediately understood that it was the successor of the demonic forest. From behind the treetops, a powerful figure of a warrior appeared covered in blue energy. He decided to stop Yung Byun. The head of the greatsword looked at the young man and praised him for having the courage to come to him all by himself. Murup replied that it is not yet known which of them was lucky in this situation and who will now be raked in full. Exuding coldness, Murup began to ponder how such a young clan was able to seize power and began to understand how. Yung Byun immediately noticed that it was getting cold around him and that it was the handiwork of the enemy. The cold spread extremely quickly. The leader asked the enemy who he was. Murup replied that this case does not concern the man. The demonic forest successor said that it was time to take the 1,000 sharp swords of Jet Sky technique from Bayan. The head of the demonic forest faced off in battle with the successor of the great sword. Their battle was just beginning to heat up. Yung Wagi stared into his opponent's eyes. Wagi thought about his father's words about proving his worth. He smiled sinisterly as he remembered the figure of his father. Cho Mugon did not fully understand the behavior of his opponent. Yung Wagi was going to prove his strength to his father by using a secret greatsword technique. Cho Mugon couldn't believe that the young man was going to use this technique and say goodbye to his life for his father. In the midst of the battle, the head of the demonic forest ordered the head of Wang to join the allies in the northwest. The man wished his boss luck in battle and said he would leave a Black Soul squad to help him. The wards went to the northwest and the head remained on the battlefield with the successor of the enemy clan. Yung Wagi radiated more and more energy with each passing second. He was going to end it all with one attack. Cho Mugon immediately understood that the young man was using reverse energy circulation. Wagi had an ace up his sleeve. Raising his sword, the head of the demonic forest shouted that Wagi wasn't the only one who decided to hide the trump card for last. Diha noticed how the head of the demonic forest was about to use his deadly technique and became very wary. He was quickly brought back into the fight by Mug Yingpi, who kept the opponent from resting and used his half-moon strike. Diha informed the chief Ronin that the successor to the greatsword was in mortal danger and might die. Mug Inpi replied that Diha would not take him long and he would quickly defeat him and then help his successor. After dodging the enemy's last attack, Diha said to slow down a bit as the victory would be his. After that, the warrior in red rose into the air and swung his sword with all his might to deliver a powerful blow. Diha managed to push the enemy back a couple of meters and he warned the Ronin that he had already analyzed his every move. Diha's shot hit the target. Mug Yingpi couldn't do anything and was defeated by the colorblind fighter. Diha confidently looked at the vanquished enemy and thanked Murup's successor for helping him. Standing tall over the Ronin's corpse, Diha said that he would find a better master in his next life. Suddenly, De's attention was drawn by a voice that announced that both of them had dealt with their opponents very quickly. It was Cho Mugon who defeated Wagi, who used reverse circulation. The head wondered what his father had taught him in the first place. The successor was killed by the body's own energy. Mugon still could not believe that the young man gave his life for his worthless father. The head of the demonic forest said that he would not forgive Yung Bayan for this. After these words, Diha shook his head sharply. Holding the successor's corpse in his hands, Mugon turned to the greatsword warriors. They immediately turned their heads towards the man. The fighters were shocked to hear that their leader had fled, and their successor along with Mug Inpi were already dead. Mughan did not wish to continue fighting for the sake of shedding blood. He asked the opponents to lower their weapons and surrender peacefully. Immediately after these words, the greatsword warriors began to throw their weapons on the ground, acknowledging their surrender. After that, they would kneel before the victors to show that they were no longer going to resist. All fighters were forced to do so since the advantage was on the side of the enemy. Their faces looked sad. Hundreds of greatsword warriors bowed before the head of the demonic forest. It was an undisputed victory for Cho Mughan. The chairman was satisfied with the result, but he did not forget that there is another front. It remains to protect the northwest. Half of the squad had almost reached there. The chairman thought that if they found out about all the events there, they would also capitulate. Cho Mughan clenched his right fist tightly and felt the victory of the demonic forest. He had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The chairman understood that this was not his merit at all and thanked his nephew who organized this event. Suddenly the man realized that he had not seen his successor for a long time. He wondered where he could have gone. Murap meanwhile stood opposite the head of the greatsword and had a not-so-pleasant dialogue with him, which was to result in a battle. John Byun continued to ask the young man who he really was because the successor of the demonic forest could not know the Blade Star technique. Murap was not going to answer this question. He just stared in the direction of the enemies, observing their emotions. Once upon a time, the most terrible war in the history of Murim took place. The most terrible battle turned out to be in the sky. The teacher held a needle in his hand and told that the battle between the 8 stars and the Alliance of Heaven Saviors was terrible. Young Murap was lying on the ground. The old man was referring to the people in battle who possessed his techniques. The teacher lowered the needle on the boy's forehead and said that if a person does not lose his fear, then he will stop. The old man commanded the student that if he meets someone who knows these techniques, he must not be left alone. Murap began to say that Manen was the first among the 8 stars to die. It was he who first drove the sacred dragon into a dead end. The successor said that he noticed strange movements in Bayan's sun until he confirmed his guesses with the sharp blade technique. Murap added that it is now clear how the great sword was able to capture the province in 10 years. Jung Byun was furious. Murap continued to emit cold blue energy, while the great sword head continued to question its origin. The young man seemed to ignore the enemy. He raised his finger and asked who else besides Bayan knew the 8-star techniques. The great sword head didn't want to answer first and told the opponent that he should explain his origin first. Murap concluded that the man does not want to make contact, so measures must be taken. Jung Byun was a little wary. The successor took a harmonious pose. His energy peaked. He was going to use one of the 8-star techniques. Murap said the man would regret not responding and using a technique called the elusive palm. Jong Byun watched the enemy's actions with a smile. He knew that this technique would not help in attacking from a distance. The head of the demonic forest continued to taunt Murap while the latter had already launched his lightning attack. Jong Byun did not have time to react to this blow and was forced to take it on himself. He flew back a couple of meters. The man brought his sword forward to counter the enemy's strength. He couldn't believe that it was really a star palm technique. After attacking the enemy with one of the 8-star techniques, Murap asked him if he wanted to start talking. Jung Byun wasn't going to answer. Then Murap directed his right hand at the enemy and decided to teach him. The greatsword head held his weapon up to stop the flow of cold energy onto his body. The man tried his best and still couldn't understand how the young man knew the techniques of the 8 stars. John Byung tightened his grip on the sword in his hand with every passing second to restrain the opponent's technique. A giant cold spot formed on the battlefield, glowing brightly. Murap demonstrated his strength. Holding back the energy, the great sword head said that he would not be able to be stopped by the cheap tricks of the star palm. Murap felt more comfortable than the enemy. He asked how he even knew about the last reception. Meanwhile, the commander of the Black Soul unit continued to search for a successor who suddenly disappeared from the roof. The man could not understand where the successor could go in such a short period of time. He should have been more careful. He realized his mistake and now continued his search. Suddenly, something unknown made him stop in his tracks. The warrior heard loud sounds coming from somewhere. But it was such a place where hardly anyone could be. But the commander of the Black Soul Squad remembered that he was dealing with the successor of the demonic forest, which could be anywhere. He headed towards the loud noises with the speed of light in time to help the successor of the demonic forest. Meanwhile, Jong Bayan began to attack the opponent, and the opponent was forced to retreat a little and defend himself. He noticed that this was not the same man who had fought with his uncle. Bayan realized that there was no point in hiding his strength. The young man also noticed that after the last attack, the enemy, on the contrary, began to reduce the distance between them in order to attack. All this time, Murap tried to understand if there was any reason for such a turn of events. Bayan prepared to strike with his sword. The demonic forest successor continued to retreat, and seeing that the enemy was about to use the technique, laughed a little. Jung Byung didn't really like such laughs during battle. He advised his opponent not to laugh in vain. However, Murap never did what he was not sure about. He asked the opponent if he really thought that it was all just like that. Jong Bayan launched a flurry of attacks, but the successor focused on his opponent's movements and deftly avoided the barrage of blows. The head of the great sword continued to rage and advance. Murap decided not to sit on the defensive any longer and prepare for the offensive. After delivering a powerful blow, Bayan again asked the young man how he knew the techniques. Murup said that somehow these are too many questions for a dead man. Gathering energy around his right palm, Murup ordered the enemy to tell him how he knew the thousand-blade technique. The demonic forest successor delivered a powerful blow which the enemy blocked with a sword. A large energy wave engulfed the forest. Zhang Bian felt no longer as safe as he had been at the time of his attack and began to worry somewhat about his future existence. However, he was not going to stop no matter what she looked at. The man rose into the air and swung his sword. While conducting this battle, the great sword head felt that he was able to keep his distance even though the enemy was unharmed. At some point, Murup began to get closer to the opponent and met his head with looks. The young man's smile was demonic. Jung Byung, on the other hand, was very alarmed at this moment. His eyes seemed to ask the young man why he came so close. When blocking an opponent's strike, the head understood very well that it takes a long time to recover between using palm techniques. He thought that some successor of the demonic forest could not possess such regeneration as a sacred dragon. However, the young man did not stop there and continued to advance. He clenched his fist in his hand as hard as he could before charging forward. Seeing the opponent's left hand, Zhang Bian was simply shocked. He did not expect that the young man also possessed this technique. At the very last moment, the head of the great sword managed to block the enemy's powerful energy strike with his weapon. Murup told the enemy that even if he had learned all the sacred techniques without talent, they were of no use. Immediately after these words, the successor used a technique called Thousand Heavenly Hands, which the enemy did not have time to follow. Murup landed a couple of meters behind the enemy after dealing him a fatal blow. The successor looked very confident. Jung Byun was just shocked by this turn of events, but he couldn't do anything. Now he understood that the young man also possessed the fist star technique. Murup told his opponent not to fool around as one of his enemies had experienced stronger blows in the past. The demonic forest successor continued to attack the great sword's head. Zhang Bian was forced to defend himself against the barrage of blows. The man realized that the young man was avoiding strong attacks in order to continue to strike. Bian could endure them only by protecting the energy pathways. But there was one problem. Energy penetrated the man's body to the bones. Now Bian understood what the young man's secret was. The great sword head decided to stop defending himself and let him take the blow so that he could catch his breath after it. Murup delivered a powerful blow to his opponent, which sent him flying a couple of tens of meters, knocking down trees along the way. Zhang Byung hadn't expected to be pushed this far, but now he could at least catch his breath a bit. However, as soon as the man thought about this, the figure of a young man who possessed heavenly energy appeared on his horizon. Zhang Byun was shocked to see the young man in front of him. Murup said that the enemy's plan did not quite work. The young man added that palm and fist techniques are not all. He also has a good temperament and a step technique. The successor swung his leg for a kick. Zhang Byun was once again forced to endure this abuse from the enemy. He recognized another 8-star technique from Murup. Getting up from the ground, the man turned his face to the enemy and asked him where he had come from. Murup, with satire in his hair, replied that he was an unsurpassed original, unlike the man lying across from him. The successor advised his enemy no longer to wallow in the mud like a pig, but to stand up and finally admit his defeat in battle. Jung Byung knew very well that he could not win this battle. But he lowered himself and looked at the ground and said that he absolutely did not care. Murup continued to mock the enemy. He put his hand to his ear as if he didn't hear and asked what Zhang was going to spit on. The head of the great sword said that he didn't care who the young man really was. He covered his body with energy and began to stand up. The man was not going to admit his defeat and rose to his feet. He said that he would kill the successor here at any cost. Murup noticed again that his enemy was using reverse circulation. He realized that they all absolutely spat on the origin of the technique. Getting into a fighting stance, Zhang Bian held the sword in front of him and said that he would take the young man with him to hell no matter what. Murup stood unmoved in his place and assessed the situation. From the appearance of the enemy, the young man understood that he was preparing to die. The successor of the demonic forest began to deliberate on how to counter this technique. He perfectly understood that palm and fist techniques would not help here. Suddenly, one thought dawned on him and his eyes widened. Murup could not believe that everything could be so simple. Opposite him, the enemy continued to rage, and he also began to spit blood. He ordered his successor to prepare for the last battle. But Qin Murup had slightly different plans for tonight. For some time, he continued to look at the enemy with wide-open eyes. Then the follower turned his back to the enemy and then turned his head back to look at his reaction. Murup realized that it was better for him to leave the battlefield altogether, since the man himself would die if he used the next technique. Zhang Byun was simply shocked by the enemy's behavior. He did not understand anything at first and followed him with his gaze. At one point, the head of the great sword shouted loudly and ordered the successor to stand still. His eyes glowed with a red flame. Jean Byung began to catch up with the enemy and asked him what kind of warrior he was after he fled the battlefield. Murup advised the man to keep quiet after he threw his son to his death, and he himself ran away like the last rat. He added that such a freak will never understand what a family is. Jong Byun became even more angry and decided to speed up. Murup was a bit worried at this point. He continued to run away from the enemy, periodically looking back in his direction. He didn't want to go into battle with someone who would eventually die himself, especially since certain restrictions were imposed on the young man. Next, he understood very well that both Uncle Jongbyun had an internal wound, so you could just run with him for half an hour. Murup calculated everything to the minute and considered his main mission to focus on himself so as not to harm the people of the demonic forest. The successor of the demonic forest avoided any confrontations with the enemy and began apologizing to him for the way things turned out. He added that he just likes well-considered decisions. At this moment, the successor's attention was diverted by something strange behind him. He was finally found by the leader of the Black Soul unit and rushed to help. However, Murup was not at all happy with such help at this moment. Zhang Bian continued to catch up with the successor and loudly ordered the uninvited guest to get out of the way. Murup immediately understood that his ward would not stand behind him but would want to protect him, so he would surely die. The leader of the Black Soul unit did exactly as the successor had assumed. He told his master to beware of this crazy grandfather. At the moment of the impact, the warrior of the demonic forest managed to protect his master and in time placed the sword under a powerful energy blow. The man did not expect such a turn of events. The force of the blow turned out to be not only powerful, but he began to cough up blood. The warrior did not expect that their difference in strength would be so colossal, but there was nowhere to retreat and he continued to strike. Zhang Byung continued to rage and shouted loudly that he would tear all his enemies to pieces. His face looked demonic. The leader of the Black Soul unit realized that he was no longer able to resist this man and prepared for certain death. However, the warrior did not expect that the successor would stand up for him. Murup used his palm technique to save his ward. At the time of the impact, the man did not understand what had happened. I just stood there with my mouth wide open and marveled at what I had just seen. Turning his head back, he realized that it was all the work of his successor. His surprise knew no bounds. Murup came up behind his ward and putting his hand on his shoulder told him to move a little to the side. The warrior objected to the master that it was too dangerous. And in his thoughts, he continued to be surprised at how powerful the blow was delivered by the successor. The man thought about keeping their clan with such a successor. He once again tried to dissuade the young man from fighting, but it was already too late. Murup was forced to enter the battle with the greatsword's head and blocked his first blow. The shock wave from this collision had a colossal force. The leader of the Black Soul squad covered his face so it wouldn't get hurt. On the battlefield, she faced giants that were beyond the teeth of an ordinary warrior. Their battle rather resembled some kind of energy war. Jung Byun was pleased with this turn of events. He smiled ominously and said that the enemy had finally caught up. Blocking the enemy's blows, Murup behaved as calmly as possible and cold-bloodedly asked why Zhang Bian was happy. The great sword head replied that the successor had finally stopped running away. But now he wondered how the young man got the sword. Having taken out the mass from behind his back, Murup asked the enemy with surprise if he really thought that he was wearing a sword just for beauty. Jung Byun was just shocked to see this in front of him. The successor said that he had learned only half of the necessary techniques. The young man had in mind the technique of thousands of sharp blades that stretched towards the sky. He asked Chong if he was right, and immediately after these words, the successor of the demonic forest rushed to attack. The head of the great sword carefully followed his movements, but they were so fast that the man did not have time to move his pupils. The last thing he noticed was a blow from the right. In a split second, the blade of the sword was at his shoulder. Zhang Bian didn't have time to react, but only noticed how blood was pouring out on the ground. He continued to watch his blood spray in different directions and couldn't believe that this was even possible. The man realized that the successor had changed his movements even before their swords clashed. It was proven energy management. With a sinister smile, the young man said that this was the complete technique of 1,000 sharp blades, which the man had never mastered. Bringing the sword to his face, the young man asked the enemy why he could use secret techniques but not himself. After these words, the successor of the demonic forest swung his sword from behind and on the nose a flurry of powerful blows towards the enemy. Zhang Byung could not do anything, and did not even notice how sharp and fast the blows managed to reach his body. The man had no choice but to scream loudly from the unbearable pain. He began to lose blood rapidly. The leader of the Black Soul Squad stood to the side and watched all of this. He couldn't believe it was the same successor he knew before. After defeating the Great Sword's head, Murup told him his secret, that he was born with the characteristic of Heavenly Yin in his body. He added that he had to take the Heavenly Yang pill to keep his body from freezing and maintain his energy balance. Placing his hand on the enemy's shoulder, the young man said that he probably thought it was a gift from heaven, but in reality it looked like a curse. Murup asked why the man tried to take control of the province if he did not know full-fledged techniques. Jung Byun looked down sadly. The man could still speak and said that he now understood how the young man knew these techniques. He called the name of the clan head of the 8 emperors. Jung Byung assumed that he was the next one to learn from this man. However, Murup replied that he would rather burn this man's corpse. The demonic forest successor agreed to reveal his secret only if Jung Byung revealed his. The head of the Great Sword felt insignificant. The successor offered to open the cards for the last time since the man would not survive anyway. John Byung replied that it was all the heads of the 8 emperors. Murup asked if he personally taught him. The young man remembered that the Sword Star had died at the hands of a sacred dragon before the start of the war. Looking at Jung Byun, he wondered how he survived the battle in the sky. The man replied that he served the clan and the Star of the Sword. He added that his dream was to take over the entire world with the sacred dragon techniques. Murup only smiled in response, that in such a person as Chong could never defeat the sacred dragon who had won the war at the heads of the 8 emperors. Looking once more at the defeated opponent who was standing on his knees, Murup said that his end was as insignificant as possible. Before the start of the war, the soldiers were forced to divide into 2 varieties. Descendants of the clan of 8 surviving emperors. Those who opposed the war rallied under Song Khan's banner, while others like John Byun continued to live hiding their true colors. Despite the fact that 30 years have passed since the battle in the sky, people still come to the valley with the residue of revenge. Murup despised such people and said if it were his will he would catch everyone. At that moment he felt sick. The woman clutched her chest and realized that he had gone a little overboard. The head of the Black Soul Squad immediately came to his aid. The successor stopped the ward and said that everything is fine with him. After that, he ordered the man to stand on the shoe chair. Murup himself began to restore his internal energy so as not to freeze completely. Energy began to rush out. The demonic forest successor sat in a lotus position and tried to concentrate. His ward watched him from behind. The man couldn't believe that the successor was stronger than Jong Byun himself and realized that the young man was hiding his strength. The ward understood that the successor had a reason to allow himself to be beaten by Cole's gang and promised to keep his mouth shut. Murup continued to sit still and emit energy. He was as focused on his body as possible. At some point, the successor opened his eyes wide and smiled. He felt his body continue to progress relentlessly. This time he managed to restore his energy balance much faster. Murup could very soon remove all restrictions from himself. The battle between 2 representatives of enemy clans has ended. It was morning on the street and dew slowly dripped from the leaves. Around began to slowly disperse and you could see the crowns of trees. Herbaceous plants bloomed beautifully on the ground. The leader of the Black Soul Squad asked his master if it was really over. The next day, the Night Forest answered firmly that it did. He smiled in the face of his charge and told him to take the trumpets with him to put an end to this war. The man was very pleased that such a successor had come into their plan. He was proud of the young man and considered him the pride of the clan. The sun slowly began to rise from behind the mountains. The representatives of the demonic forest took with them the corpse of the head of the enemy clan and headed for the road. The war ended without any hesitation or problems. The Great Sword Clan could no longer withstand the power of the demonic forest. The leadership of the Northwest was able to hold out long enough for reinforcements from the demonic forest to come to their aid. The Great Sword was preparing for battle, but when they saw Jong Byun's severed head, they immediately threw their weapons on the floor. The northwestern gangs that had joined the demonic forest were simply shocked and also very happy. All allies began to rejoice just on the battlefield. The war ended, and after 10 years' power over Chongqing returned to the hands of the demonic forest. The next day, the war was remembered with kind words. After it ended, there was much more gloom for the demonic forest. Murup came to look at the prisoners together with Diha. The aide reported that the prisoners were gathered and the injured were being dealt with in the northwest. The successor looked into the eyes of one of the prisoners. Diha added that all of these people were either Ronin or warriors of defeated clans in the past. After examining some of the men, Murup concluded that Mug Inpi was collecting real shit. Diha didn't quite understand this. He looked at his successor's back and mentally praised him for keeping his word. Now he could consider him a distinguished person. At some point Diha called out to the successor and got his attention. Murup asked what else he needed. Diha said that he has a lot of respect for the work he has done. Murup liked it and said to continue. Diha asked his successor to ask him one more question. Murup replied, let him bet, but only with respect. The warrior said that the successor was already able to take over Chongqing after completing his previous mission. He was interested in the young man's next goal. After thinking for a while, the successor asked De if he could believe what he had to say. The assistant answered positively. Chin Murup remembered the words of his teacher who told him to choose a path so that he could always see the light in front of him. His uncle had a completely different opinion on this score. The demon forest always lived with its head held high. Remembering these phrases with a smile, Murup replied to his assistant that he wanted to achieve what everyone wants. Diha did not quite understand where his boss was heading. He asked him what exactly every person on this planet wants. The young man replied that it was the mighty power of Sichuan province. He laid the foundation in the form of Chongqing and eventually planned to sort things out gradually. Murup smiled and said that the parallel demonic forest should regain its former glory, but this is definitely not a matter of one day. Immediately after these words, he was interrupted by the commander of the Black Soul Squad. Chin Voren announced the following, that the head of the clan was looking for him. Murup asked the man if the head believed his words. Zhang Waren was petrified and replied that he did not fully understand it. Cho Mugan wanted to know who killed Yung Bian. Voren promised his successor to keep his mouth shut, so he didn't tell the truth. He was forced to invent a fairy tale in which he was saved by a mysterious martial artist. Of course, there was also the fate of the truth about Murup. The successor did not want his father to find out about his abilities, but he was wary of how he would perceive this machination of lies. Murup immediately decided to go to his uncle and entered the room with his assistants. He folded his hands together in greeting. The heads of the northwestern clans were also present at the meeting. Chief Sokka said that they have been waiting for him for a long time. Murup was surprised that the union had already become so friendly. Sok laughed and said that there was a way to celebrate the victory. Cho Mugan congratulated the successor and praised him for his efforts reporting some resolved issues with the Northwest. Chief Sokka was grateful that Cho Mugan had given one of the 3 million silver greatswords to rebuild the Northwest. Murup was pleased because the tense situation was no longer in the air and the greatsword was out of the question. The successor sat opposite the head and advised that everything was resolved this way. He asked why he was needed at this meeting. Taking out the scroll, the head of the demonic forest said that his father had ordered to reward his grandson for his achievements. Opening the document, Cho Mugan began to read that as the current head of the demonic forest, he announced the following. Those present listened attentively to the fact that Chin Murup had a tremendous impact on the future of the clan and therefore should be rewarded. Cho Mugan appointed Murup as the commander of the Shining Dragon Squad as ordered by the previous head of the demonic forest. Murup did not understand at all what was happening here and why he had this status. This only burdened him as a successor. Chairman Narima advised his successor not to make such a facial expression but to sit straight and not forget about formalities. Murup agreed with the old man and said that he accepted this order. However, his face left her with better emotions. Cho Mugan ordered Chief Urim to bring in a sword of silver radiance and a commander's seal which symbolized strength and loyalty. Yu Hassan said that this sword has special symbolism. He added that this sword was used by Murup's mother. The successor took the weapon in his hands and looked at him with surprise. He was told that this was the only thing left after Irina. Yu Hassan added that Murup's mother was also a member of the Shining Dragon Squad during her lifetime. Murup began to listen more carefully. Cho Mugan said his sister was appointed vice commander of the unit that his older brother was leading at the time. Chin Murup bowed and said that he accepts the will of his relatives and undertakes to continue the prosperity of the unit. Cho Mugan was pleased with this result. However, prosperity and loyalty were not what he was most interested in. He thought of his father who had not given this order because of this. Cho Mugan believed that this was necessary for the good of Murup himself. The former head of the demonic forest wanted his grandson to be able to finally win the favor of those around him. After handing over the sword, Yu Hassan informed about the location of the detachment's shelter and congratulated the young man on his appointment. All those present, including head Narima, folded their hands together as a sign of respect and also congratulated the successor on his appointment. Some of the representatives of the Northwest even shed a tear when they heard the story of this squad and the Sword of Light. Udiha and Waren were proud of their boss. They looked at him with their heads held high and smiled. Murup looked pleased, although he did not understand why he needed it. However, the young man was not going to contradict his head. The head of Naramu suddenly turned to his vis-a-vis from Waramu and called him a friend. He asked Hassan what he needed. The men did not tell the young man who he would lead. But it didn't matter because everyone believed in his strength and loyalty. Murap left the meeting room with his chief aide. Diha asked if the successor knew about the composition of the squad. The leader of the Black Soul Squad told him that the composition of the squad was quite unusual. Murap asked what exactly that meant. Diha said that there were people in the Shining Sword Squad who held leadership positions in the Great Sword Clan before the defeat. These people were in search of faction heads, and when they returned they had already lost. Diha believed that they would be hostile. Murap immediately understood that these people had been robbed of their wealth, and now they were also forced to work for him. Diha confirmed everything. The successor began to think what to do with these men. He couldn't just put them in the same positions in the demonic forest. Murap did not understand only one thing: why those old farts pushed these devils into his mother's unit and now his own. Murap arrived at the shelter of his squad. They were preparing to go into the middle and were a little worried about the outcome. The successor went first. He slowly opened the front wooden door, which immediately creaked unpleasantly throughout the room. Those present immediately paid attention to the entrance. They looked there with cold eyes and expected who would appear there. The current members of the Shining Dragon Squad were somewhat shocked when they saw who had come to visit them. Murap showed his face to those present. He didn't feel very comfortable and wondered what to do next. After looking at the men, Murap said that he did not know anyone here, but they looked really menacing. The former commander in the Great Sword Clan was the first to speak. Pun asked the guest if he was indeed the same successor. Murap replied that he was really the successor and introduced himself as a great strategist and also a real nice guy. The men listened as the young man praised himself for shaking up the war plans with his brains and thus winning. Murap also celebrated his victory over Wagi and ended by wiping the entire Great Sword Clan off the face of the earth. Udiha did not feel very comfortable after such an introduction. He was a little worried about what the sweat on his face was saying. The warrior in red was unlikely to match his successor in achievement, so he simply introduced himself as Udiha. Stepping forward, Murap offered to leave everything in the past as the men were already part of the demonic forest. He decided to sit opposite so that the audience could see him better. The young man slowly leaned on the arm of the chair. The successor sat more comfortably, clasped his hands together, and with an ominous smile greeted the Salig in the demonic forest. Those present were a little shocked by the behavior of the successor. They still did not know how to react to his words and actions. The unit of the Shining Dragon was disbanded for quite a long time. Because of this, the condition of the room left much to be desired. Murap told his wards that they will have to live here, so they must immediately bring mops and brooms to clean. Pun was not very pleased with such an order from the young man. He gave him a sidelong look of disdain. However, the man crossed himself and agreed to carry out the order. He had nothing left in such a situation. The former commander called Ju Cho and Hu En to follow him. Someone else was going to get water. Murap was surprised that men were so obedient. He assumed it was because they had no other choice. The successor watched the wards with great enthusiasm. He wanted to train them using the Iron Hand method. Most of the captives joined the various organizations of the demonic forest and were forced to follow the orders of another command. Pun looked like a man of character from afar. He was better known under the pseudonym Lightning Sword. Han Gung was well versed in the art of the single-edged sword. He was also the commander of one of the squads in the Great Sword. A tall man named Ju Cho was a spearmaster, but now he is forced to carry water on it. He didn't look very pleased. Hu En was a very short man but a very good archer. Now the warrior was forced to work as a sweeper. A man named Zhang Yu looked like a monk, but he was not a monk at all. This man used a stick in battle. Diha informed his boss that all of these people were elite and the demonic forest could have been defeated if not for the successor's plan. Murap understood that he now had to re-educate these men but told Dehi not to overexert his charges. Deka was very surprised to hear these words because the successor wanted to deal with them more harshly. Murap asked to leave him alone. Leaving the square, the successor said that he had already entrusted the training of the warriors to one person and asked De to follow this as well. The warrior in red did not quite understand what I meant by the successor. He could not understand who exactly could be entrusted with this work. The former elite of the Great Sword were forced to work illegally. They finally finished cleaning and put the mop back in place. The men debated the identity of the successor who had single-handedly made the Great Sword disappear from the world map. Hu En said that there was no one to blame for the defeat but himself. Han Gung disagreed and said that he fought with all his might. A conflict broke out between the former commanders of their units on this account. The soldiers' opinions diverged and they began to clamor. Suddenly Hu En felt a powerful blow. It just popped into his head. The young man did not expect such a turn. The warrior became very angry after being unexpectedly hit on the head. He looked around and asked who did it. There was no need to look far. It was Enchu who had come to monitor the captives under the orders of the demonic forest successor. Seeing such a giant in front of him, Huan was immediately frightened. He felt that things would not go according to their script. Enchu was supposed to keep an eye on the warriors from today. Now Diha understood who Qin Murup meant by the overseer. Enchu turned to one of the captives and asked him if he had heard anything at all about parental submission. Huan asked what that even meant. Ronan Undercover asked why the young man was always messing around with his elders. Diha already during this time to the mental structure of the warrior. Perhaps only he understood that the giant meant the concept of subordination. Han Gung was the largest among the warriors and replied to the big man that they were all about the same age group here. And Chu said that he would never believe it because the man looked like an old fart compared to the dwarf. And Chu turned to the bald man nearby calling him a monk and asked if the two were really the same age. Young Yu didn't really like being called a monk. He spat on the floor and replied that he was not a monk at all. And Chu grabbed the man's head and asked why he shaved his head then. Young-yu replied that his hair just fell out. Diha watched all this action from the side. He didn't interfere, he just thought that Enchu had a real talent for screwing people up. Meanwhile, Murup decided to dig up something in the clan's archives. He came to an old building that had not yet been cleaned. The current leader of the Radiant Dragon clan was very interested in one fact, whether there was anything left from his predecessors in these places. The young man looked at the piece of paper in the frame. There was a handwritten text. Murup immediately recognized this handwriting. He looked sadly at these letters which were written many years ago. It made him a little sad and reminisce. He remembered his dead mother and asked her if she was even watching her son, who had become the commander of the Shining Dragon. He promised her that this was just the beginning. Moving the frame a little lower, Murup read the message that told him to go through the forest. It was written by Cho Iron, who considered herself an incredible woman. Having read these lines, Muripa fell into a stupor. Now he understood where the legs of his complacency grew from. He was very much like his mother, who also loved to joke. Murup appointed Yu De as the vice commander of the Shining Dragon Squad. And Chu in turn became the main defender. There were 5 commanders in the detachment who led their subgroups. It was the same elite that became the leadership thanks to their achievements. They all possessed the same type of weapon that was used in the 8 Heavens soul art. Single-edged and double-edged sword, bow, spear, stick. Murup assembled a squad that he considered the most productive. He gathered everyone in front of him and ordered the first subgroup to step forward. Panen was at the head of this subgroup. With his squad, the man made a lesson in advance and said that they were waiting for orders. Murup ordered Enchu to fight the first subgroup. The successor wanted to train his current wards a little. Enchu was very happy and asked how long he could beat the men. Murup replied that he did not care as long as the giant did not kill them. Strovan was very pleased. And Chu only enjoyed beating someone in this life. He began to laugh sinisterly and tell someone that his successor had allowed him to make puree out of people. Murup hit him on the head and told him not to do that. And Chu replied that he did not really want to fight then and offered to entrust the task to De. Murup replied that this warrior is a weakling. Diha did not really like this attitude towards him. Clenching his teeth in anger, Diha said that he would cope with this task. Murup and Enchu began to mock the warrior. They gave each other a high five, and then Diha realized that everything was planned this way from the beginning. Pan En apologized and interrupted the commander. He asked what was going on and called it all a real circus. Murup replied that it was not a circus and the vice commander was not made up by a finger, because then how could he defeat Mug Inpi himself? Pan En began to draw his sword and was about to test the vice commander's skills. He asked if it was possible to disobey subordination in battle. Udiha was also ready to fight and replied that he could. The Shining Dragon's vice commander invited his charge to begin. The warrior in red was immediately surrounded by fighters from all sides. Deha knew that Pan En was considered one of the best fighters in the Great Sword. The warriors rushed into battle against one enemy. Deha came up with an idea to use his own wards against the contractor. Pan En advanced on the vice commander from the front. One of the ordinary privates was standing behind Ude at this moment. The warrior in red took this man and intercepted his weapon. He covered his body with the body of one of the opponents. Pan En was very unhappy with such actions from the vice commander. He shouted that he had no honor and said to fight fair. Deha boldly answered that honesty will not help you win the battle, and sometimes you even have to wallow a little in the mud. Murup recognized his own words in this phrase and smiled. He was very pleased and called De a pupil of his school. The successor bid farewell to those present and ordered Chu to replace De when he was tired. Ronan asked how long they would fight. Murip replied that they would not pray for mercy yet. He added that this procedure will have to be carried out every day. This day was the beginning of the nightmare training of the Shining Dragon Squad. Chu performed his role as a thug flawlessly. Only a few days have passed and the soldiers have already forgotten what such pride is. After training, they could not stand up or even speak. Already a month later, the head of the demonic forest was forced to use the power of this squad. He had no other choice. After reading one message, Cho Mugon learned that they were in mortal danger and needed to act immediately. It happened at the moment when summer was changing to autumn. Someone unknown destroyed someone's life and killed a person. The head of the demonic forest entrusted the Shining Dragon Squad with the first task. Although it was the first mission, it was very, very important. The head of the demonic forest held a meeting in the Tezen chamber. He called to him only one head Naram, with whom he was drinking tea. At some point, the door to the room opened and announced that the successor had arrived. The chairman ordered to let him in. Chin Murim walked into the meeting room and clasped his hands together. He greeted the head of the demonic forest and Cho Mugon greeted back. Cho Mugon said that he spoke with the head of Naram here about the new squad and asked his nephew how he was doing. Murip replied that he liked it. The head of the demonic forest warned that these people used to hold high positions, so there might be problems with them. Murip only laughed, remembering the ordeal. The head of Naramu sat silently in his place and did not say a word. He didn't even say hello, as if something was bothering him at that moment. The same could be said for the head of the demonic forest. Cho Mugon was immediately behind them when he discussed the new squad with his nephew. Murip immediately felt that something was wrong. He didn't understand why go around when you can say everything to your face. When the successor took the cup of tea, Cho Mugon immediately asked if he had not seen Yurin yet. Murip once understood that soon they would meet. The chairman confirmed the young man's guesses and said that it would happen on the next mission. He added that it will be extremely difficult. Murip clearly and confidently answered that his squad was ready for this. He said to immediately put all the cards on the table. Cho Mugon explained to someone that his wife's family is now in Pajong County. The road there takes about 10 days. Lowering his gaze downward, the head of the demonic forest said that it was necessary to find the father-in-law and brother-in-law who had disappeared somewhere. Murip was somewhat surprised by this statement. He asked how these people could just disappear in a small county. Chairman Naramu replied that there were various rumors. It even goes so far as to say that someone from Sanshin did it. The old man also mentioned the bloody sky and the demon madness. Murip thought that things were bad since the last two belonged to the three great thieves. But he also knew that Sanshin did not have a very good reputation, so he could also include himself in this evil four of hell. Chairman Narama warned that if the three great evils are really involved, then the governor can certainly ask for help. The old man noted that the young man learns very quickly, but to meet the real masters of martial arts knowledge will not be enough. Murip has not yet revealed his trump cards to the commanders-in-chief. He got up from the table and confidently put his hand on the table. The young man said that it was necessary to leave now since it was not clear whether the disappeared were still alive. The head of the demonic forest did not object to his nephew. He just wished him luck and told him to be careful. Chairman Naramu joined the chairman's wishes. He worried about his successor no less than his own uncle in this dangerous mission. Murip noticed their concern. The young man turned his head slightly in their direction and promised that he would return from this mission very soon. The night after the meeting, the successor went to the bamboo forest where he often walked. He discovered a conversation with one of his wards. He ordered the warrior to find out more information about the Sichuan Master's conflicts and possibly their weaknesses. All this was to be done by the commander of the secret squad, Sanshin So Jaiwan. He asked if he was not there to guard the king. Murip replied that Chu would take care of this task. He was certainly a bit stupid, but not completely a moron. Next, he asked if there was any news from Manhwa. Jin Huan replied that the commander was always busy with his own affairs. Sanshin includes all the mountains and rivers, as well as those who have been involved in banditry for a couple of decades and will not be able to change quickly. Sanshin pursues the goal of coexistence with Murim. At such a time, they get rid of all those who interfered and value only the labor force. Murip didn't really like the fact that the Sanshins were drawn into the conflict with the demonic forest because they were on good terms. The successor constantly handed something under his nose, solving his problems. Janhuan asked his boss if he was okay. Murip replied that everything was absolutely normal and ordered his ward to go. Zhang Huan unequivocally agreed with the king. The main shelter of the Shining Dragon Squad took on a completely different look after being occupied. It looked like a newly renovated building. Pun En is very tired from constant training. Han Gun completely agreed with him and asked Jung Yu for his opinion. Meanwhile, the man's nickname began to suit him. He was sitting in the lotus position by the window and looked like a monk. He said he was just grateful to be alive. Poon and called the man a madman living in his own world. Ju Cho said that he would like to take a break now because his future plans include opening a small shop. Hu En intervened in the dialogue and showed them the jewelry his sister had given him. He promised her to bring nice clothes if he came back. Han Zhen shouted loudly and ordered the man to realize that this was just training and that no one was going to kill them. At that moment, the successor burst into the movement, knocking out the door with his foot. He ordered his wards to immediately assemble and move forward. Han Zhen had forgotten that there was a successor besides the Ronin. Murup ordered his wards to hurry as Peijin was waiting for them. Noticing that one of the soldiers was not going to move, Murup approached him and slapped him on the bald head. Murup felt very strange things about himself after this blow. He looked at the bald spot and said it looked like a baby's ass. Jung Yu was not happy with this turn of events. He felt all the fury of the commander and immediately began to gather. The 57-man squad of the Shining Dragon went on a campaign to Peijin. They immediately went to the province on horseback. Murup told his wards that they should reach the city in 6 days and ordered to see that no one was left behind. Diha perfectly understood that it would take at least 10 days to travel to Peijin, but he decided not to object to his successor. The rest of the wards were in complete agreement with their master. They said that they would carry out every order of their commander. A long journey awaited the demonic forest squad. They were forced to move at an accelerated speed to keep up. As the successor had promised, they reached the entrance to Peijin County in 6 days. It required fewer breaks and increased speed. The two girls were walking along the road and were discussing that the demonic forest had destroyed the Great Sword and regained supremacy in Sichuan. One of the ladies said that she had heard that the successor had come up with the plan for the demonic forest, and she wondered how he did it. It was a disciple of the divine sword Tang Reiwa. She raised her eyes and said that she would know everything very soon. Her assistant asked what she meant. Tang Reiwa replied that the demonic forest is the in-laws of the Zhang family, so they should know. The assistant said that if Sanshin was involved in the case, then the flower bell should be immediately notified and reinforcements should be expected. Tang Reiwa asked why the assistant did not believe her. The ward replied that she was just worried about her lady. Tan Reiwa suggested that the Faceless Mountain King might be involved in the incident. The head of the clan of 8 emperors had this nickname. The lady said that the warriors of the Silver Valley are stronger than the commanders of the middle clans, and even the Flower Bell cannot stand against them. She could not allow the son of the head of the 8 emperors to rule the Silver Valley because it was too dangerous. The assistant asked the lady if she remembered hearing about the invincible monster within energy and suggested that it could also be a rumor. After these words, Tang Reiwa stopped in place and thought. She agreed that there was logic in the girl's words. The lady thought that Sanshin had declared that he wanted to achieve coexistence with the rest of the world, after which the level of security and trade had increased. The true face of their leader remained unrevealed, but the woman believed that Sanshin would not want to start a blood war. Tan Reiwa said that she was also skeptical of the rumors, but they should not be ignored either, as this was the task of their clan. Suddenly the ward noticed unknown soldiers behind and suggested to her mistress, just in case, to use the masking technique. Tan Reiwa assessed the situation around her and realized that the warriors were not from the local countries. She agreed with the idea of a ward. The two women decided to use their clan's secret cloaking technique. They barely changed in appearance. The assistant told the lady not to worry, as even one of the 10 strongest warriors would not be able to suspect anything after this disguise. One of the soldiers approached them very quickly. It was Chin Murup, who immediately looked at the passers-by he passed. He looked very intently at the faces of the girls. They seemed quite suspicious to him, especially considering the terrain factor. The young man looked into the face of one of the girls, but could not see anything there. The eyes were hidden in the shadow of the headdress. A squad of shining dragons drove past 2 mysterious strangers. The assistant told the lady that they did not suspect anything. Murup immediately after that asked De if he had noticed those 2 strangers. Enchu began to wriggle out and was silenced by the commander. The successor assumed that the girls were going to Peijin and ordered the vice commander to attach a couple of men to them as soon as they reached the village. Diha asked why this was necessary. Murup replied that he was absolutely sure that one of them was under the camouflage technique. Diha clarified whether the successor really meant masking and how much he himself had not noticed anything of the sort. Murup replied that the texture of their skin was disturbed, and this can only be done on purpose. The girls also hid their inner energy. The Radiant Dragon Squad has arrived in Peijin County. The The successor ordered the vice commander to order the privates to watch the girls but carefully, and Chu found it strange that the street was too quiet. Diha agreed with this and felt that the city was somewhat under the influence of robbers. Murup said that you can find out about it from the Chan family, but for now you should leave the horses to rest and do the same yourself. Murup's wards discussed behind his back the involvement of the Mountain King in this situation and did not understand why he needed it. They dropped the option with this man because they considered him a little more cunning. Murup mentally called the men idiots since he was the Mountain King. But the next one agreed with what was most strange here because he believed that no one should spread rumors about him here. The deserted streets spoke of the fact that a disappearance was taking place here, and Murup was unhappy that Sanchin was involved in the case. A squad of shining dragons drove up to a building guarded by a sentry. The man came from the John clan and was named Cha Wai. The guard asked the guests where they came from. Murup got off his horse and answered that he had come here on the orders of the head of the demonic forest. The entire squad began to dismount. Cha Wai replied that they were expected, but they arrived a little earlier than expected. Murup told his wards that they could rest, and he himself went to see his aunt. Punen followed the order. The watchman immediately understood that the young man was aware that his aunt was changing her head and could not return to the demonic forest. Arriving at the ladies' quarters, the man announced that he had brought with him the commander of the Shining Dragon Squad. The woman was surprised that everything happened so quickly. Murup and Deka went into the room and put their hands together as a sign of respect. They introduced themselves as the squad commander and vice commander. Cho Mugen's wife Jong In-ren met the guests and immediately thanked them for their huge contribution to the victory over the Great Sword. Ingren wanted to offer tea to her nephew, but there was none. Sitting down at the table, Murup replied that the water would be enough for him. The successor immediately said that he was surprised that he met almost no people on the way here. Ingren replied that they still continue to find the bodies of the dead warriors. The woman reported that her father and brother were returning from the capital when they disappeared. Human corpses were found in a deep forest 50 kilometers from Pajin. Murup asked if search operations were conducted there. Ingren replied that it was being held but was too burdensome due to the number of people. The successor assumed that the corpses left by the enemy meant something and asked if the woman had received something like a letter. Ingren replied that when they had lost all hope, a corpse was brought to the estate along with a letter. She put this letter on the table and added that the enemy demands to send him a receipt for the amount of 3 million silver. Murup took this letter and began to read. He immediately appreciated the crude handwriting, but there was strength in the lines of the writing. The successor asked whether the family had such funds at all. Ingren replied that it was all the Zhang family's savings for 10 years. The woman added that the enemy said he would send 1 corpse a day until the money demand was met. His wife's head and hands began to shake. She said that this is already the 5th corpse and you simply can't drag it any further. Murup watched his aunt worry. He considered her a very strong woman as she had to endure a lot. The successor rose to his feet and said that the enemy probably knew that there was no such money and took into account the fact that the Chong family was related to the demonic forest. Murup said that the enemies made a big mistake when she contacted them. He promised his aunt to return the people safe and sound. As she led the guests away, the woman told them to contact her if they needed anything and wished them luck. Murup agreed with his aunt. Opening the front door, the successor turned to the vice commander and ordered him to call all the commanders immediately. The young man slowly took hold of the door and opened it with great force. It was necessary to hurry in order not to lose time. Suddenly, the successor felt a jolt in his abdomen. He had to face a little girl. Murup looked down at the child and asked if she was okay. He also wondered who she was. Sitting on the ground, the girl called the successor a real ruffian and a pawn if he does not know her name. The girl introduced herself as Cho Urim. She was the only daughter of the head of the demonic forest as well as a potential successor. Now Murup put together all the puzzles in his head, but he did not understand how such a restless daughter was born to such calm parents. The successor asked the girl where she shared her front teeth. Laughing, the little girl replied that she wanted to exchange them for sweets. Murup praised the girl for laughing in such a situation. Urim replied that nothing can be changed with ordinary tears. She added that if she was going to be sad herself, she would make the rest do it too. The successor was very surprised by such thoughts of the girl. Urim assumed that the man in front of her was a successor from Chongqing. Murup confirmed her words and told her to call him Kanim. Saying goodbye to the guests, Urim shouted that she was glad to meet her and hopes for the next meeting. Murup waved her goodbye. Having departed a little from the previous dialogue, the successor returned to harsh reality and said that it was necessary to advance in 2 hours. Diha was surprised at such haste from the successor. He asked if he managed to find out anything yet. Murup said that he would deal with it now. The successor thought that if there were many hostages, then they were definitely not being held in Pagan, otherwise they would have been counted immediately. Murup perfectly understood that it was necessary to act as carefully as possible. He was going to comb the entire territory of a 50-kilometer zone in the forest. He ordered his wards to proceed with caution and left the elder De behind. He warned that no development of events can be ruled out. Hun and decided to clarify some information. He asked the successor why one could not simply ambush the enemy in Pagan. Murup replied that then the lives of the hostages could be in danger and their task was to save the head of Chong and his son. The successor advised the wards to meet with the hunters to find out if anyone had stolen food from their traps, as the hostages needed to be fed something. Diha listened carefully to his successor and understood that he was very principled at such moments. Murup seemed to become a completely different person. At the end, the successor warned his wards that their main task is not to punish the guilty but to save the hostages. Han Gung informed the successor that the two girls he had been following had recently entered the city and were being followed. Murup said he needed to meet them first, so he ordered his squad to rest and prepare for now. Murup ordered De to stay here and took Chu with him. The vice commander was surprised by such a decision and understood that the successor saw a threat in the girls. And Chu asked his boss to go to the inn first as he really wanted to eat. Murup said that it is possible to suffer. Continuing the dialogue, the successor noticed something strange and fast and turned his head to the right to confirm his guesses. A trace of someone's movements remained on the roof. And Chu asked the successor what he had noticed there because it was empty. However, Murup could not be wrong. It was one of the same girls who followed Pagan County yesterday. The girl was very worried. Her face looked scared and she kept moving forward. She constantly looked around as if expecting danger behind her. The girl used a camouflage technique to hide. It was the assistant who noticed that the young man looked in her direction and could not believe that someone other than their clan was able to notice their technique. The girl understood that the young man was very dangerous. At that moment, Murup together with Chu entered the back of the girl and scared her to death. Meanwhile, the divine sword disciple, nicknamed Beautiful Flower Tang Reiwa, was going to have a drink at their hideout. She was waiting for her assistant Sojian and assumed that something might have happened to her, since she has been gone for a long time. As soon as the girl thought about her assistants, a voice sounded behind her announcing the arrival of the lady. Tang Reiwa turned her head back and with a smile on her face asked the assistant if she had learned anything useful. Sojin apologized to her mistress and announced that she had been caught. Behind her stood Murup and Chu. Tan Reiwa, she couldn't believe that someone had managed to recognize the Sejong technique. Chu invited the girls to dinner. Chu whispered into the boss's ear that girls like that. Murup thought. Seojong was still trying to gauge the strength of these two. Murup sat down at the table and Tan Reiwa immediately asked him what he needed. The successor said he just wanted a drink. He told Chu to order whatever he wanted. Chu was overjoyed to be able to eat and drink. Tan Reiwa behaved very seriously. She silently looked in the direction of the uninvited guests, waiting for what they would do. Murup behaved very loosely. He raised his glass and asked the girls if they wanted to keep them company.